button, which means we've got to wait for the stream to fire up all across the fruited plains of the internet before we go ahead and get started. Let's make sure that we're alive and well, that the old cobwebs are off. We weren't here on yesterday. It was Sunday. We did a Saturday show where we covered half of the other half of Friday, but it's Monday, and that means we've got a whole new fresh set of transcripts coming right out of the Michael Sussmann trial. This, of course, is Hillary Clinton's former campaign lawyer indicted for lying to the FBI. He's in the middle of trial. We're in week 2. Today was day 6. We're going to, as usual, get our bearings straight, take a look at the mind map. But I want to show you the transcripts, and these are nice and fresh. They're coming in hot. You can see May 23rd, 9:05 a.m. We've got the morning session that we're going to dive through today. We've got 2 different witnesses that we're going to be spending a lot of time on. And if we go back to the mind map, and I always forget to do this, but the mind map is now going to be shared here very shortly. I'm going to link this up, throw this down in the chat. And so if you want to follow along at home, you're free to do that. You can click that in. It's typically best to do it on a web browser, on a desktop browser. But if you follow along, you'll remember that we're talking about this guy, Michael Sussmann, Hillary Clinton, former campaign lawyer. He was working at a law firm called Perkins Coie under this guy, Mark Elias. Mark Elias has already been called in as a witness, and so we've already heard from him. But it involves Hillary Clinton and Hillary for America, and the entire campaign, you recall back in 2016, very heated, very contested, because it involved Donald Trump. And so we've been going through, following along the trial for the last week or so, and we picked up last week on Friday with some pretty interesting testimony from these individuals here. Remember, we talked about 2 ex-CIA officials on Friday, Mark Chaddison and Kevin P. Actually, we talked about both these guys on Saturday, I believe it was, because the morning on Friday, we heard a lot from Robbie Mook. Now, the CIA stuff is very interesting. Of course, it's important. That's why the government called them as witnesses. But these were 2 people who weren't really part of the main underlying hoax. I mean, really the story under the indictment involves a meeting that took place with the FBI. All of this was taking place September, it was, I think, September 19th. Should have that sunk in my memory at this point in time. But back in September, there was a meeting, but there was a secondary meeting with the CIA. Not only the FBI, but the CIA. He's only indicted for the one meeting with the FBI, but they're showing that he also met with the CIA, just to kind of show there's a pattern here. There's a lot more than just one simple meeting. We left off with that last week on Friday. We also, very, very important testimony from Robbie Mook, the Hillary Clinton campaign manager. And it was kind of shocking because he came out on Friday and he said something like this. He said that when you were going to take this story up to the highest upper echelon in the Hillary Clinton campaign, how high up did it go? Asked the prosecutor. Did it go to, the campaign? You're the campaign manager. I mean, you're pretty high. Did it go much higher than that? And it said, actually, yeah, it went all the way up to the very top, involved even Hillary Clinton. Clinton says, question, so you told Miss Clinton we want to give this to the media? He says, I don't really remember the substance of the conversation, but notionally the discussion was, hey, we have this. We want to share it with a reporter. Prosecutor asked, and how did Miss Clinton respond? And he said, she agreed to that. Dun, dun, dun. This was the big moment where we all realized, yeah, Hillary Clinton signed off on this thing. She was the person who gave it the thumbs up, the green check mark that said, take all this stuff, post that tweet that went out on October 31st, try to shove this October surprise down everybody's throat. And that was all of last week's testimony. Today now, we've got 3 people that were in court today. We're only going to talk about 2 of them this morning because they only got through 2 of them in court today. Bill Priestap, he was the FBI assistant director at the time, and we've talked a lot about this guy. We'll sort of get our bearings straight on him. We also have Ryan Gaynor. He's another actual FBI former special agent, or he might be a current special agent. I'm not entirely sure, but he's somebody who testified all day today. We had big portions of the morning testimony, and I think he goes well into the afternoon before we get to Allison Sands, who is the final FBI technical analyst, who I think they started with today, but she's going to pick back up tomorrow. And so we'll pick back up tomorrow with her. But we also heard several different names come out. So Ryan Gaynor is an FBI special agent who talked about these other people, Section Chief Maffa, David Dagon, who was a Georgia Tech researcher. I mean, the tentacles of this thing just continue to spiral out of control, and we're going to follow them wherever they lead. But Curtis, Heidi, Allison Sands, also other names that came up. But I want to start, before we dump into the transcripts, I want to start by getting our memory and our recollections refreshed a little bit about who Bill Priestep is. Because remember, this all is involved. We have this whole tentacle, this whole mind map of all these different arms and extensions and different organizations that are involved. But I want to just remind ourselves, right? This is about a criminal indictment for one guy and one charge, and that's lying to the FBI. So it's John Durham, special counsel, indicting Michael Sussmann here. And this is all about one particular meeting that took place September 2016. And there were no notes about this meeting. James Baker and Michael Sussmann were kind of pals. They were kind of texting buddies to some degree. And there were no notes about that meeting. So nobody really knows what happened. The allegation is that Michael Sussmann went there, said he was not there on behalf of a client. Turns out he was. He was representing Hillary Clinton. And that's the lie. But we're trying to piece together whether that was a material lie, whether it was a lie at all, how this whole thing happened. And in order to do that, we like to look at notes and like to look at actual evidence about what is going on. And Bill Priestep took some notes. Now, not from the actual meeting itself, because Bill wasn't at that meeting. This meeting only took place between James and Michael. But Bill actually talked to James after the fact and took some notes about that conversation. So there was a secondary conversation that Bill took notes about, and those notes look just like this. We've spent some time talking about them. A lot of the testimony today is going to be Bill walking us through these notes and saying, well, we have a circle with a 1 in it. Michael Sussmann dash attorney, Perkins Coie, comma, Coie, comma, dash, said not doing this for any client, right? These are his notes, not about the meeting with Michael Sussmann, because again, he was not at the meeting, but he did take notes about what James Baker told him about the meeting that James had with Michael Sussmann. So there's a lot of moving parts, and we've got a lot of transcripts to attend to. And so let's go ahead and do that. As soon as I can flip over there, this is what they look like. Boom. And before we dive in, I want to thank a couple super chats that came in already. We had James R. Crypto said, I've always admired the FBI and I need to pledge you this. Thanks. And so James R. Crypto said, I've always admired the FBI, and James is donating to the Transcript Dono Fund. I pay for these transcripts out of pocket, and so I appreciate those super chats. These are $1.20 a page. And so we wouldn't be able to do this without your support. And so I want to thank everybody who does submit a super chat, or even just like this video or share it with somebody, or becomes a member on YouTube, or joins our community over at Locals, or any one of those ways to support it. I appreciate it. And of course, we are helping good people every day at our law firm in Scottsdale, the R&R Law Group. All of our contact information is down in the description below. And so if you know anybody who is charged with a crime in our state, we would love the opportunity to help. We'd love it if you gave us a call. All right. So without any further ado, now let's take a look at who we've got here. So it is Monday morning, 9:05 a.m., bright and early there in D.C. They're there in Judge Cooper's courtroom. We've got the 4 prosecutors that we're familiar with. Keelty's back in the house, along with the other 4 defense attorneys. They're from Latham and Watkins. And as I mentioned at the start of the show, we've only got 2 witnesses today. So Special Agent Ryan Gaynor and then Edward Priestep, who goes by Bill. We'll be calling him Bill throughout the show. So we've got Ryan and Bill that we'll get to today. And we left off with sort of a blank slate on Friday, wrapping up with the CIA agents. And so everybody got a nice weekend of rest. And we know that nobody left. They were all staying in town. They were not going back home to New York or to any other places. And so they come back, hopefully nice and rested. The judge says, "Good morning." And both parties announce. Court says, Mr. Berkowitz, who is one of the defense attorneys, he's up at the podium and says, why don't you stay right there, sir? I would like to pick up where we left off on Friday. We've got some preliminary issues that we need to discuss before the jurors come back in. And Judge Cooper says, I would like to pick up where we left off on Friday, which was discussing the issue about this guy. Remember this guy, Eric Lichtblau, who was one of the New York Times reporters who we've been fighting a lot about. He's over in the mind map as well. And the mind map sort of talks about him being a source where maybe Sussman or Fusion or some FBI agents were sort of funneling information to, and he was supposed to be vetting them. His name came up with Robbie Mook and many others. And remember, there's sort of like this multi-layered just web. It's almost like a mind map of just interfacing between the DNC, Hillary Clinton campaign advisors, people at Perkins Coie, other lawyers, all these researchers, even from some universities like Georgia Tech. And then we've got all the media figures that Fusion GPS was interfacing with. And so it's just, there's multiple layers to this thing. And so the judge is saying now, because remember, I haven't even started reading these things yet. And Eric Lichtblau was one of the New York Times journalists who actually got a lawyer and said, if you even think about calling me as a witness here, I want to intervene and start invoking my First Amendment privileges. I'm a journalist. I don't have to say anything. I don't have to out my sources at all. And so I'm not going to do that. And he's sort of becoming litigious now. And so the judge is saying, all right, how are we going to piece this all together? Because I don't know if we're going to call this guy, or if we do call him, what he's going to talk about. And so the judge says, look, we've got some of this anticipated testimony here. And I guess without getting into the First Amendment issues and whether there is, or to what extent there actually is, qualified reporter's privilege, which is what he would be asserting, I guess the judge says, I'd like some clarification on the expected testimony, and then some questions on the government's scope of cross, given what you told me about the direct. So the judge is saying, I'd sort of like to be able to piece together a little bit about what you're intending to ask him and what the cross-examination might look like. So, government prosecutor, what are you going to ask? And defense, what are you going to ask? Judge Cooper says, I've allowed in this case, or at least have been prepared to allow, examination on cross that might exceed the scope on the direct, as long as it would be testimony that would be admissible in the other side's case in chief. So he sort of lays out some of the rules. He says, but here, it seems to me that the government would be precluded from calling Lichtblau in its case under the DOJ policy. So in other words, the DOJ, the prosecutors, Durham, you can't call these people. And the judge says, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's how I think your policy is read. So correct me if I'm wrong. But the judge goes on. He says, so the question then becomes, what is the appropriate scope of the cross, given that you intend to ask him, knowing that the government would not have been able to call him in their case? So I guess the question is, what do you intend? I know you've said you're going to limit the direct conversations with Sussman, but the question is, to what end, on what issues, to what issues in the case will Mr. Lichtblau's testimony go? And Berkowitz is still up there. Remember, the judge said, don't you go anywhere, buddy. And so he's sitting there and, oh, sure, judge. He says, so, and I won't speak to the DOJ policy in a situation where there's a reporter and he's willing to because somebody has waived whether he was going to talk. So this gets a little bit complex because remember, Sussman sort of wants Lichtblau to come in and testify. Sussman is saying that Lichtblau is going to be a friendly sort of witness. And he's saying, I waive my protection, saying that Lichtblau has some attorney privileges and he's got to protect his sources. Sussman saying, I was a source. You don't need to protect me. I don't want your attorney, your journalistic privilege, not one bit. You can talk all you want about me because I know you're going to come and help my case. And so Sussman is saying, it's waived. We don't even need to talk about reporter journalistic privilege. That's ridiculous. So then he says, and this is his defense making that argument. The court says, if Mr. Lichtblau had not been called by the defense, the question I had is, would the government have been able to call him? Okay, so Berkowitz says, okay, look, in summary, Your Honor, let me summarize this for you. He says, Your Honor, we would expect that the scope of our direct, so if they call this reporter and they examine him, they would say it would only be to discuss Sussman and Jaffe's approach to Lichtblau. So it would be Michael Sussman, Richard Jaffe, tech executive number 1, and Lichtblau, their sort of communications with each other. The conversations about setting up a meetings they had about that, discussions that Sussman had with Lichtblau after they met in person, same thing about September, and all the updates about that. They said we would then, after we have those updates, focus on, or at least potentially elicit testimony relative to Mr. Sussman reaching out to Lichtblau after Baker had called him and asked him for the identity. And if you've been following along for some time, remember that Baker was asked specifically about this. They said, you said that Sussman was being all weird and he was sort of not telling you things and all this stuff, but the defense was cross-examining Baker, James Baker, who was at the FBI general counsel over there. And they said, Mr. Baker, isn't it true that when you called Sussman back up on the phone and you said, can you tell us the name of the reporter that you've been talking to? Wasn't Sussman very, very friendly with you? Wasn't he accommodating? Didn't he give you that request? And Baker was like, yeah, he actually did. Who was it? It was Lichtblau. It was all this. So it all is kind of coming full circle again. So they're saying that they would ask him about that because, of course, that was favorable to their case because Sussman gave Baker the reporter's identity. They would inquire of Mr. Lichtblau about any conversations that he had with the FBI since his name was turned over. The defense says, as you'll remember, Mr. Baker said that he had a couple of meetings. He said that you'll remember the book that somebody might sign by Mr. Myers just to orient your interaction. And so the defense says, Judge, potentially, I don't know what we would go into or that we would get into that, but it would at least be fair game, and that's what our plan is. The court says, okay, so without going through all those areas, part of that would appear to go to whether Sussman disclosed the clients to Lichtblau and what his knowledge was of who Sussman may or may not have been representing. Do any of those areas you've just listed also go into the joint venture motive? Berkowitz says, I think so, Your Honor. And so they're still discussing some of this preliminary stuff. And as I mentioned previously, it's good to see what they're talking about, but a lot of this stuff is hypothetical until they actually get into it, and the judge will settle it on the fly. Talking about his state of mind is going to be in the press, and it could be an issue, talking about scope. And so it's sort of like these people are plotting their path a little bit. They're saying, we're going to take that turn and then this turn and then this turn and then that turn. But when they get going, maybe that's not the right way that that things are moving. And so they're going to have to rearrange as they go. But now we see that we get this settled, and the court says, all right, good morning. Says, I would like to avoid these privilege issues if possible. And the court, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get down far enough. They're still going through this stuff. So they say the court, they're talking about confidentiality of clients now, talking about relevance and scope, still talking about Lichtblau. And we'll get to Lichtblau when somebody calls Lichtblau. All right, so we'll get there if somebody calls Lichtblau. All right, final word briefly. So they're talking about fusion and some more privilege things. So let's get into it. All right. So the court says, all right, we're going to continue to noodle about this, right? And they're noodling about it. Noodle away. Are we ready to call our next witness? Mr. Keelty, the prosecutor who had to leave on family leave, is back now. It says, we are, Your Honor. Just one issue. Another one. Can we get started already? Prosecutor says mechanically. I've discussed this with the defense with this particular issue. Mr. Bill, who we're going to talk about, says we're going to show him his notebook. All right. And this might be a very important notebook. We're going to hear from him. Says we've marked it for identification, and we're going to ask to approach. We're going to show him his notebook to establish that this, in fact, was his notebook. And then we plan on putting certain pages of the notebook on the Elmo, which is the overhead projector. And we're going to move those pages right into evidence, as well as showing him basically a copy of the 3 pages that we just moved in. It's ultimately going to go all back to the jury. Okay, that's what we're doing, Judge, just so you know. And we've been fighting over these notes for a long time. He's talking about, I believe, the notebook where this page came from, which was Bill's notes. And we're going to break this down painfully with a little microscope soon. But he is talking about this. He says we don't plan on sending the whole notebook as evidence due to the nature of the information that's in it. There are other pages that could be problematic. They say the defense is okay with that. Court says, all right, so just to review, you're going to show him particular pages, move only those pages, yeah, and you're going to send copies of the pages back in lieu of the entire notebook, yeah. Judge says, okay. And so that sounds fine. And who do we have today then? Prosecutor says, all right, Your Honor, here's the lineup. We got Bill Priestep coming in, Mr. Gaynor. Then we have Miss Sands and Mr. Heidi is coming in. Judge says, okay. And I received your motion about Mr. Heidi. We'll talk about that later when he comes on. And then they say, bring those jurors in here. And they come marching in. It's Monday morning. They're like, oh, great. Here we are again. Coffee was cold. Breakfast is sour. How long am I going to sit here? Who are these people? Oh, yeah, it's a trial. The court says, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Everyone has a nice weekend. They're like, whatever, Judge. He's like, please be seated. They sit down. We are ready to get started again. I hope everyone has been rested and ready to go. Mr. Keelty, prosecutor, would you like to call the government's next witness? And he says, yes, Your Honor, I'd love to. Today we call Mr. Bill Priestep, Your Honor. Good morning, sir. Take your mask off, swear in. He does. Spell your name. Where are you employed, sir? As the prosecutor gets up and starts asking questions. He says, I'm at a consulting firm called Trenchcoat Advisors, which is just perfect for an ex-FBI guy. And the prosecutor says, what generally is Trenchcoat Advisors? He says, we try to protect businesses from nation-state threats. And what's your position? I'm a founder over there. And prior to that there, Bill, where were you employed? He says, I was at the FBI. How long? 21 years. And when did you retire there, Bill? I said, gosh, I have to think back. The official date was April of 19th, I believe. April of 19. And he goes on. Prosecutor asks him, and what was your most recent position there when you were there, Bill? He says, well, back then I was the assistant director for counterintelligence. Ooh. And what position did you hold at the FBI prior to that, back in 2016? He says, oh, back then, like around the time we're talking in this case, back then I was the assistant director of counterintelligence. And okay, you mentioned counterintelligence. What exactly does that term mean? What do you do? He says, we protect the United States interests from nation states threats. Prosecutor says, okay. And what were some of your duties? He says, well, basically I oversaw the counterintelligence efforts globally. And the prosecutor is confirming, so Bill, you were in charge. Is that what you're saying here? Yep, that's what I'm saying. And does counterintelligence actually investigate cases, Bill? Yeah. And at any one time, approximately how many cases are under your purview? He says, well, the exact number is classified, but thousands? Prosecutor asks, thousands? Bill says, yes. Prosecutor says, okay, thank you. Well, what I'd like to do is turn your attention over to September 2016. Did there come a time, Bill, when you learned about an allegation involving the Trump Organization and a Russian bank called Alfa Bank? Bill, yes, he says there was. And what is your understanding, if any, of whether those allegations were brought to the attention of the FBI? And Bill asks a question. He says, was the information at all given to the FBI? Prosecutor says, yes. Bill says, yes. Okay, yeah. In that case, it was. And the prosecutor asks him, okay, Bill, do you know how that information was brought to the FBI? I do not. Do you have an understanding of whether the FBI opened an investigation into those allegations? Bill says, let me put it this way. I know the FBI looked into the allegations. The prosecutor says, okay, but you're unsure if a case was opened? Is that fair? He says, a formal case? I am unsure. So, okay. And did you have, I just can't believe, let me put it this way. I know the FBI looked into the allegations. What does he think? He's in like a Hollywood movie? What are you talking about? And did you have any role in that investigation? He says, role? I was advised of, I guess at some point, possibly more than once, people providing me a briefing, like summarized what we learned. Okay. Prosecutor says, sure. Okay, let me ask you this question. Would this investigation have fallen under the counterintelligence division, right? We're talking about Trump, Russia, Alfa Bank, 2016. Fall under counterintelligence? Yes. And as the head of counterintelligence, the investigation was ultimately under your control. Is that correct, Bill? Yes. Your Honor, may I approach this witness here? Court says, you may. I'll allow it. Feeling good today. You may approach there. A prosecutor does. He says, Mr. Bill, I'm showing you what's been marked for ID as government exhibit. Looks like a notebook here. Is that right? Yeah. And if you open the inside cover of this notebook, is there a name listed on there? Yes, my name. And does that look like your handwriting there? Yes. Is there an entry for the dates when this notebook was used? Bill says, yes, there was. In fact, it was September 2nd of 2016 through December 27th of 2016. Prosecutor says, perfect. Is there a phone number? Yeah. Is that your phone number, Bill? Yeah. Okay, Bill, I'm going to ask you to flip through a couple of pages of this notebook to see if you're recognizing the handwriting. And Bill's just flipping through there. He's like, no, I remember that. I remember that. He says, oh, just any pages? Prosecutor's like, yeah. Okay, just take a look through there to make sure you recognize the handwriting. Okay, it's not complicated. I know you worked at the FBI, but come on. Bill says, yes, I recognize the handwriting as my own, which is amazing. Prosecutor says, great, thank you. I'm going to take that notebook back. And Bill, so what you're saying here is this government exhibit definitely appears like it is yours. Is that true? This is your notebook, Bill? He says, yes, there is. Okay. Now, what I would like to do is I'm going to show you some pages that are in this notebook. I'm going to put them here on this overhead projector Elmo screen. Now, bear with me because this is our first time using the Elmo, and I'm a government prosecutor, and I'm not sure how most of this works. The witness says, I know, I'm at the FBI. That's no problem. Take your time. So they fumble around for 45 minutes. Prosecutor comes back and says, okay, did you see the first page that's on the screen right now? You finally see this one? And Bill's like, yeah, nice job. You got it. He says, it's redacted. But do you see the date in the top right corner? He says, I do. What is that date? It says September 16, 2016. And for the record, that page that has been marked here is our exhibit. Is that true? He says, yeah. Does this appear to be your handwriting? It does. But it's a little tough for me to see, though. And the prosecutor says, yeah, let me see if I can work this one out 1 second. So they adjust the contrast on the Elmo. So these geniuses are, flipping knobs and moving things. They got books and moving stuff around. Give me your shoe there, Bill. All right, put the shoe. All right, yes, Your Honor. So there, bear with us, says the court. Prosecutor. I was only joking at first. I didn't realize he was actually going to break down here. Says prosecutor's fine. Like, I can just bring him up the notebook, judge, so he can just read it. And the court says, well, let's see if we can get it to the jury so the jury can see it. Is that the best we can do? The judge says. The courtroom deputy's melting down, says, I'm trying. The court says, okay, you might want to zoom in a little bit. Finally, prosecutor's back. Judge says, there we go. Guilty says, that looks good. Everybody calms back down and says, okay. All right, so the prosecutor's finally like, all right, it's now 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Transcript's over. Anyways, just kidding. So it's a question, Mr. Priestep. Now that we've got this all functional, do you recognize this? Does this look like your handwriting? He says yes. Okay. See the top left date there? Yeah, we've got it. It's September 22nd, 2016. And does that appear to be your initials next to that date? It does. And do these notes appear to refer to the Alpha Bank allegations? Yes, they do. They appear to refer to that. Okay, Bill, I'm going to ask you to show this for you. Does this look like it's a copy from the original book? So they just made a copy and now he's saying it matches. And does the second page of 289 appear to be a copy of that? Looks exactly like the notebook we just looked at. Yeah. And Bill, when you went to government meetings for counterintelligence, what did you do there? Was it your practice to take notes? He says, well, at some meetings I did. And in your role as the, director of counterintelligence, what would be the reason to take notes at these meetings? Bill says, it's to help me remember what was being discussed or what I was told. In your role as the assistant director, was it your practice to take notes during telephone calls? Bill says sometimes. And what about conversations with people? Did you take notes then? Sometimes. And how about when you recorded information, was it done as accurately as possible? Bill, did you do it the very best? He says, yeah. And why is that? Why do you need accurate information? It says, I wanted to be reminded of the information that I was conveyed as accurately as possible. Prosecutor says, that's great. And that was important. Is that correct? Yes, it was. And with regard to these exhibits that we just talked about, do you remember the context in which you took those notes? He says, I do not. Doesn't remember. And based on your note practice, taking says, does it appear that these notes were taken on a matter that you were aware of? Meaning, let me ask you a different question. The prosecutor is going to rephrase this. He says, is it your practice to take contemporaneous notes? Like, do you take them at the same time you're listening? FBI Bill says yes. Okay. Prosecutor now says, is it fair to say that you don't fully and accurately recall the events that led you to take these notes? So we're looking at these notes. You acknowledge you took them, but you don't recall the events that led you to take this note. Is that fair? Correct. And based on your note-taking practices, do you believe these notes fairly and accurately reflected your knowledge at the time to the best of your ability? So they're trying to use these notes, and this witness doesn't even remember taking the notes or the underlying incident, right? And so this prosecutor is trying to get some use out of these things because they happen to be pretty dang useful. So the prosecutor finally says, all right, Your Honor, we're going to move these exhibits in, and I'm going to put on the screen a second page of these notes. Bill, can you start from the top and read through the entire thing? And Bill says, okay, the whole thing? Prosecutor says, oh yeah, you betcha, baby. We're going through this in depth. So buckle up, Billy boy. Bill says, okay. Says there's a number 1 in the upper left corner. And let's follow along here. Oh, this is the exact note. See this here? 1 up here. And these are the notes that he's looking at, literally looking at. Says Michael Sussman, dash, attorney, semicolon, Perkins, comma, Coy, comma, dash, said not doing this for any client. Now, I'm not going to open this up because we're going to go back to the transcript, but I want to show you what he's going to be running us through. Right here, you see a bullet point, former DOJ official. Bullet point represents DNC. We go down. We see NYTS, Washington Post, or Wall Street Journal on Friday, Secret Trump org, all of this. And we're going to go through it in detail. So now he's reading through it. The prosecutor is asking him, go ahead. He says above that, there's kind of an angle. It says Todd Hinnon. Then it says Michael Sussman. After Michael Sussman, there's an abbreviation for attorney, Perkins Coie. There's a dash. There's a couple of bullet points. One says represents the DNC and Clinton Foundation, etc. A second bullet point reads, former DOJ officials been approached by prominent cyber people. In parentheses, we see academics, corporate POCs, or what he calls point of contacts. To the right of that, Bill explains, kind of in the margin, it's people like, to me, he says, it looks like there's a list of names. He says, but Matt, he says, I think it's Blaze or Blosey, Stephen Bellovin, and then Susan Landau. And so he's pointing, where is he talking about? Oh, you know, these people, they must be redacted over here. So these names have been redacted in this sort of area. People, so we never got to see that. This was a part of Discovery. So we now have names that were not in the original Discovery. So people, till we see that there in the notes, those names are presumably there. After Steve and Susan's names, there's letters PH in parentheses, PH for phonetics, saying I don't know the exact spelling. Under NYTS, that's the abbreviation for New York Times, Washington Post on Friday. The left, it says foreign power, like a Trump organization. On the right, it says secret Trump org server that had communications with Alpha Bank in Moscow. We see it says connected to the Kremlin. Talks about a hospital in the US used as a communications node. There's a word Tor next to it. Below it says another article's coming out later, 3 to 4 weeks later, about the Trump organization contacting foreign nations. The last line reads CID. In the FBI parlance, that stands for Criminal Investigative Division. We see that down here at the bottom. CID here. He's a Tor expert. We saw that. He has a Tor expert, right? They have a Tor expert. We don't know anything about Tor. They've got one. So the prosecutor's like, perfect. You did a nice job reading that, Billy. Okay, great. Thank you. We'll get through a couple of these acronyms that are in the notes in a second. But Bill, I got to ask you a couple questions about some of those names you just rifled off here. Do you remember any of those names? Are those familiar to you back in September 2016? And Bill says, no, actually, just the Trump one. All right. And Bill says, prosecutor says, and you understand here that someone provided you this info, like somebody gave this to you? Yes. And this FBI jargon, do you have a general understanding of what Tor is? Do you understand how this works, Bill? And Bill says, I used to have a much better one. You know what? I'd rather not, right? Doesn't want to explain it because it's complicated. And if you're the FBI, he just skips the whole thing. Sir, can you explain what Tor, you're what? The former assistant director of counterintelligence, responsible for global security in the United States. Yeah. Can you explain what Tor is to us unsophisticated plebes? No, I can't. Prosecutor's like, okay, I guess we'll just skip this then. You're embarrassing me, Bill. Prosecutor says, fair enough then. Sheesh. Okay, we've got a bunch of jurors over here. I need you to make me look good here. But he says, you just mentioned CID. Is that the Criminal Investigative Division? Yeah. Is that different than the one you led over at Counterintelligence? He says, yes, it was. And in the top left-hand corner, top right of your notes, it says Michael Sussman, attorney Perkins Coie. You see that? Yeah. And there's a dash. And right next to the dash, it says, quote, said not doing this for any client. Do you see that, Bill? I do. Bill, in September, did you know who Mr. Sussman was? No, I did not. And again, when taking notes, it was your job to write down pertinent information. He says, yeah, it was. Was it your practice to take down pertinent information? I wanted to document things as accurately as possible. Bill, in your role as the assistant director, were there occasions when you had to brief your superiors, you had to pass information along? Yeah. And what role did your notes play when you gave those briefs? He says, it depends. Sometimes I wouldn't even use notes. Sometimes I'd use these types of notes, and other times I would just have typed talking points. It just kind of depends. But there were times when you used notes, right? And you did at least sometimes use notes, yeah. And in the notes, I guess it would be in the beginning, it said you wrote New York Times, Washington Post, right? And what if your understanding of what that refers to? He says, Bill's like, I don't recall what that refers to, but let's just say, generally speaking, that if I were to write something like that down, it generally meant an article on a topic that would be coming out, because Bill can't remember this. Now, unfortunately, a lot of these FBI people, very intelligent lawyers like Mark Elias and many others, for some reason, they can remember a lot and they can just do really well, build law firms and, accomplish all sorts of important things in the world. but they can't remember one of the gravest threats to America, which back in 2016 they were working on, which was, of course, the Trump-Russia collusion, which we heard nothing about. We couldn't hear the end of for many, many, many months after the election was over. It led to Trump's entire first impeachment. So now they're having a difficult time, even though this was like the pinnacle of urgency back in 2016. He can't recall. Okay. So the prosecutor says, but you don't have any specific recollection with these notes? No, I do not. And do you have any recollection of meeting with any media outlets about Trump, Russia, Alpha Bank? Bill says, no, I do not. Bill, turning your attention over to March 6 of 2017, what was your position back then? Bill says, same, counterintelligence. Do you have any recollection of attending that meeting, another March 16th meeting? Bill says, no, I don't. To be clear, I attended lots of meetings. And the prosecutor says, yeah, I'm sure you did, government bureaucrats. Priestep, based on your experience as the former assistant director of counterintelligence, does the FBI collect and analyze a significant amount of day-to-day basis? Yeah. And what are some of the sources of information? Oh, he says it runs the gamut, meaning every source that one could imagine. Does the FBI collect information outside of the government? Yeah. And from your understanding, how does the FBI collect information outside of the government? Bill says a variety of ways. We couldn't do our job if we didn't. And what sort of ways, Bill, does the FBI use? He says there's times the FBI engages in what I'd refer to as technical collection. Prosecutor says, yes, there's the times the FBI talks to people who provide information. Okay, those are very common. And the prosecutor asks him, thank you. When you say you talk to people, are these like people, like human people? I'm assuming they're human people, right? These are people who come into the FBI who are not a part of the government. Is that correct? Yeah. And with respect to human sources, is it important for the FBI to understand how those individuals came into possession of information that they provide, right? Don't you want to know the source? Isn't it, in other words, material? This is not a little white lie. This is a very critical part of the entire investigation. Sussman shows up at the FBI's doorstep. It's material to the conversation, whether he's working for Hillary or not. It's going to change the course of the investigation. It's going to make the FBI receive it differently. Isn't it important, Bill? Bill asks a question, answers a question with a question. Is it important? Important. It's something we would like to know. Okay. And why is that, Bill? And he says, I say we, I'm not with the FBI anymore, obviously. But when the FBI obtains information, explains Bill, it basically has to look at it and decide what to do with it, right? And in other words, it is something that the FBI should look into further, and so on and so forth. But as a result, it considers a variety of factors before deciding what, if anything, to do with the information. Prosecutor says, okay, Bill, based on your experience, is it important to understand the motivation of an individual bringing the information to the FBI? Bill does his question again. He says, important? I guess I'd say it is relevant. It's not dispositive. So he's being squirrely. Now, again, remember this. All of these are government witnesses, but it doesn't mean that they're friendly witnesses. Bill is Team FBI, Team DNC. He's part of the same cabal that was behind all of this. They just got busted because Trump won. And now there's a special counsel that's investigating them all. So he's not being cooperative. And this has been the case. You're going to see that in the cross-examination, it's going to be a lot friendlier. Now we're going to compare and contrast this with the other FBI agent who comes back in and is a little bit more on the government side. Let's watch. So the prosecutor is saying, all right, look, is it important to understand the motivation? Like, important, bro. Okay, based on your experience here, Bill, is it important to understand if someone is providing information to the FBI on behalf of somebody else? Okay, so we're just same question, 35 different ways because Bill's being a jerk and doesn't want to answer it right. Answer from Bill. Again, we can get information from a variety of sources to include a variety of human beings who come to the FBI motivated by a variety of things. I know, but we're asking if somebody is motivated by taking out a political opponent in the months leading and weeks leading up to an election. You know what we're talking about. Prosecutor says, in your testimony is that motivation is important to the FBI. Is that correct? He says, well, it's certainly relevant. He doesn't want to say important, but he'll say relevant. I'm not going to use your word. I'll use mine. Bill, the jury's heard testimony in this case that Sussman brought in Alpha Bank allegations to the FBI in September. Based on your experience, Bill, if Sussman had brought these allegations to the FBI on behalf of Hillary Clinton's campaign, Would that have mattered to the FBI? We're going to wrap this all up. Would that have mattered, Bill? And Bill says, again, anybody bringing information to the FBI were interested. The FBI is interested in knowing the motivation of the person providing the information. Prosecutor says, right, got that. But particularly if someone's bringing information on the behalf of a political campaign, is that important for the FBI to know? Bill says, I guess. I'm struggling a bit on your use of the word important. There's a variety of factors on the importance of that. And so it's the motivation, it's relevant, but it's not the only factor. Prosecutor says, right, but I'm asking, if somebody bringing information on behalf of a political campaign, is that a factor the FBI would look into? Would you look into that factor? Finally, Bill says, yes. Like, sheesh. Thanks, Bill. Okay, so if Mr. Sussman had brought the allegations into the FBI on behalf of and the prosecutor backs up, says, what is a confidential human source as the FBI defines the term? And the Bill says, I apologize. So the prosecutor was kind of on a roll there, and then he just changes gears. He kind of like is going good in one direction, and then just like we get jerked over here to a whole nother conversation. What is a confidential human source as the FBI defines the term? Bill's like, I don't know. I apologize. I don't remember the strict definition. It's basically somebody who is providing the FBI information that the FBI is not, let's just say, publicly acknowledging that they're doing. Okay. And so you try to keep the relationship private. Okay. Understood. So the prosecutor now asks Bill, and we're asking Bill the same question. Bill said there are all of these other various different factors that exist, and the prosecutor is just unraveling them. Okay, let's take this one, and let's take that one, and let's see which one of these are important and which ones matter. How about this, Bill? If Sussman had brought in these Alfa Bank allegations to the FBI on behalf of a confidential human source, would that have mattered? Would that have mattered to you? Not saying Sussman is a confidential human source, not saying anybody else is, but let's just play around with this hypothetical, this little variable. What if he was? Would that be relevant? Bill says, yeah, it would be. It would have been relevant. And why is that? Bill says, again, a variety of people providing information to the FBI all day. The FBI can't look into every single allegation that's brought to our attention. But we do, when we obtain information, we're trying to make a decision. Should we look into this? Is it something that we should be spending taxpayer money on and resources to investigate it? And so we look into all of this. And the prosecutor says, sure, got that. And if confidential human sources, if they provided information that's confidential, well, we got to track that and make sure that we can make a determination about whether to go forward or not. So they're talking now about confidential human sources. And the prosecutor asks, generally, how do confidential human sources bring in information to the FBI if they are somebody in that role? Bill says, generally, we have a primary point of contact within the organization. And so when a CHS, a confidential human source, comes in, they would contact their person on a regular basis and provide it to him that way. And the prosecutor closes, he says, and what, if any, concerns would you have if a CHS bypassed his handler to bring information to the FBI? Bill says, I would want to know why he or she was doing that. So it sounds like we might be talking about a confidential human source here very soon. This could be interesting. Now, the prosecutor says, all right, nothing further. Then we get cross-examination. We got Michael Bosworth coming out. We're taking a quick parchment. I think I said parchment, which is like a paper, right? I was feeling parched. I had to quench my thirst is what I was trying to say. But we just finished the direct exam of Bill. Very important former FBI assistant director. And we're back in charge now with the defense. Bosworth takes the stand and he said, all right, good morning, Bill. I'm Bosworth. I'm one of the lawyers representing Sussman. We've never met before, have we? No. And you didn't meet with the defense to prepare for your testimony today, did you? No. And you didn't meet with the government either, correct? He says, well, actually, I did meet with the government previously. And the defense says, but you testified before the grand jury in June, right? Yeah. And since that time, have you met with either side since the grand jury? Bill says no. And Bill, you never met Michael Sussman either, right? I don't recall ever meeting him. Ever speaking to him? No, don't recall that either. Do you recall being in a meeting with Michael Sussman back in September of 2016? I do not. Defense says, do you remember being in any meeting with whoever it was that was telling you the information you recorded in your notes? Were you in a meeting with anybody that caused you to write those notes down, Bill? Bill says, no, I wasn't. Because he wasn't, remember? He took those notes based on what Jim Baker told him happened in the meeting. Defense says, you spoke about your long career at the FBI. You started out as a special agent, yeah? Yeah. And you rose through the ranks, yeah. Did you spend most of your time over those years at counterintelligence? He says, well, I wouldn't say most of the years. I bounced around a little bit. But the counterintelligence division, though, he says, is that where cases regarding the sort of nation state threats that you described take place? Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about those threats? When you talk about nation state threats, what do you mean? Bill's getting a little bit jokey here, and he says, how much time do you have? I'd be happy to explain this, but us FBI agents, we have a lot of coloring books we're working on, and I'd like to show you our drawings. How much time do you have? And the court says, not that much time. So pick it up. Defense says, well, let's go for the short version, Bill. Bill says, short version, the U.S. is the sole superpower on the face of this earth. And as a result, there are a whole lot of nations who don't like that. And so a lot of nations are doing things every day to either steal from us or undermine what we're trying to accomplish, or otherwise influence our activities so that they can gain strategic advantage over our country. All right, well, you know, the people who are doing the most thieving from me, as far as I can tell, is U.S. government, not Russia. But anyways, and is Russia one of those countries, they ask? Yeah. Yes, they are. Okay. In the fall of 2016, there was an extensive investigation taking place into counterintelligence. Is that true, Bill? Yeah. And what was the investigation called, if you remember? Remember, this is the defense attorney who is now asking these questions. And I think I forgot to put Bill on the screen. There's Bill. And says, what was that investigation called, Bill? He says, I think the one you're referring to is Crossfire Hurricane. It is. And can you tell us what that was? What was Crossfire Hurricane, Bill? You were at the FBI. What was the focus? And Bill says, oh, he's being jokey again. And so the defense says, okay, again, briefly, all right, briefly. Bill says, I guess, let me put it this way. It was whether the Russians were or were trying to interfere with the 2016 presidential election. Defense says, and is that the kind of threat from a nation state that the counterintelligence division would investigate? Bill says, yes, it is. Because it's a threat to the United States democracy, correct? Yes, it is. And that's something that's important for you to protect, isn't it, Bill, FBI? Yes, it is. Because your job is to protect our country against threats from foreign actors, correct? And that's an investigation that you do remember about, correct? The Crossfire Hurricane investigation? He says, I certainly remember pieces. That's correct. Okay. And do you remember approximately how many agents were involved in that investigation? And Bill says, oh, no, I don't remember that. A good number of people, though. Is that fair to say? Yeah. And you were asked on direct examination about the allegation of another connection between Trump and Russia concerning Alpha Bank. Correct? Yes, I was. And you don't remember much about that investigation, though, do you? That's also true. Defense asks, how come you remember more details of the Crossfire Hurricane investigation than you do of the Alpha Bank investigation? And the obvious answer is because one's more useful to him than the other one. But his answer says, if I recall, and again, it's a big quote, because if I don't remember the particulars, but it was not because something I was regularly briefed on. He says it's a big if. And if I recall correctly, at the end of the day, it didn't amount to much. Okay, defense says, and the Crossfire Hurricane investigation was something you were more regularly briefed on? Yeah, Alpha Bank, not so much. Correct. So if he got briefed on it, he remembers it. If he didn't get briefed, no idea. But you received some information that the investigation took place with Alpha Bank, right? Yeah. And you don't remember the details because that was 6 years ago. And, you're not even as smart as Mark Elias was, and he can't even remember this. So we're just a bunch of dum-dums here, right? Yeah. Okay. And it's hard to remember details of events from 6 years ago, correct? I mean, like what you had for lunch, not what one of the biggest threats to America was, I guess. I don't know. But he says, correct. You were asked about your notes, and just to be clear, you don't actually remember taking those notes down, right? I do not. I don't even remember writing those notes down. You don't remember who you were talking to when you wrote those notes down. I do not. You don't remember when you took those notes down. Correct. You don't remember what you did with those notes. Correct. Correct. And these are your notes, right? He says, it certainly looks like my handwriting. I mean, yeah. And looking at those notes, which you've reviewed, presumably, today and before, it still doesn't jog your memory of the conversation, correct? It does not. Doesn't remember anything. Okay. Let's look briefly at just a couple of pieces. And look, remember what the notes were. Okay. These are a lot of notes. Sussman, attorney Perkins Coie, secret Trump org server that has communications with Alfa Bank connected to the Kremlin. Okay. Look, I'm sure that these FBI bureaucrats sit around in meetings all day doing very little, honestly. And just look at their track record if you doubt me on protecting America, okay? They couldn't even protect the stinking Capitol building when everybody was broadcasting that they were going to be there. So they're sitting around in all these meetings. How many meetings look like this, saying a secret Trump org server that has communications with the stinking Kremlin? Are there so many of these meetings that Bill's just like, oh, another Kremlin hack? These guys are all over the place. I'll just put that put that in my to do someday pile, along with the other bills and other notes. I'll just get to those later. This is a big deal. Trump is running against Hillary. This is in September. He's neck and neck with her. And he just doesn't remember it. Do you believe that for a minute? I mean, what else was going on there that would have been a bigger story than Trump in September being connected with Russia? Literally, and he's at the FBI. He's got all of the dots connected. Give me a stinking break. What a joke. All right, so he can't remember that, but then he remembers Crossfire Hurricane just a couple short years later. So they want to go look at a couple pieces of paper. I want to ask you some questions about that investigation and some other meetings that you may or may not remember since you're so dumb. Okay, they pull up another meeting on there. Look at the portion of this exhibit. Says apparently it's hard to remember. Okay, so they're joking here. Let's look at the portion of the government exhibit that Keelty just put in evidence, okay? The defense says apparently it's hard to remember events of 5 minutes ago, too, because he can't remember what exhibit it is. So then he pulls out the exhibit. He says, okay, so here it says Michael Sussman, attorney, Perkins Coie, represents the DNC Clinton, right? Talking about this section here, represents the DNC and the Clinton Foundation, etc. Got all that. He's highlighting that there. Looking at those notes, do you remember what the DNC is? He says, I don't even remember writing this, but that should be the Democratic National Committee. How about the Clinton Foundation? Yeah. And those are the only clients and only parties that are being listed there. Yep. Those are the only parties I see on my notes. So either those were the only parties you were told that Sussman represents, or those were the only parties mentioned that you wrote down. One of those things is true. Yeah. Yes. He says, I see the word or the abbreviation, etc. So there could be more there, right? He sees that word, etc. there. So there could be some other additional things. Defense says, okay, but you were asked questions before about how you might use your notes, and there weren't a whole lot of folks above you in the FBI. Is that fair? You were kind of at the top? Yeah. And there's the director, right? Yes. And there's a deputy director who is number 2, which is you. And there are assistant directors. Yes. And you reported to whom, by the way? He says, well, it just depends which year. And they're talking about the hierarchy here. Do you remember someone named Joseph Pienka? Yeah. Can you tell us who he is? He says, I actually don't know his role today, but back at the time he was over there at the FBI Washington field office. Did he have any association with Crossfire Hurricane? Yeah. How about Peter Strzok, one of the FBI lovers who was texting with Lisa Page about derailing Donald? Yeah, he texted with him too. Do you know him? He says, Peter, I only hesitate on this because of the years. At some point, Peter was one of my deputies, what they call a deputy assistant director. So Peter Strzok under Bill Priestap. I don't remember the exact dates Peter was in the role, but there was also somebody named Curtis Hyde. Is that someone you know? Yeah. Who is that? He says, well, if I'm remembering Curtis correctly, that was somebody else out of the FBI Chicago office. And if you remember back on the mind map, when we talked about this on day 1, at day 2 of the trial, day 1 was jury selection. Day 2, we had these 2 FBI special agents who were very useful to us because we learned that, well, from David Martin about DNS data and how this all works on the internet, but then from Scott Hellman. He was the guy who actually sort of received the thumb drives and did an initial analysis on it before he sent it over to the Chicago field office, where they said that it was all garbage. So we have Scott Hellman, and then they're going to reference the Chicago field office here because he got it and then sent it over there. So we're sort of now reviewing what happened to the actual documents that Michael Sussman provided to the FBI when he met with James Baker. They're talking about this dash. Now, said not doing this for any client. You see that right here? You were asked about that there, Bill. You remember anything more about why you wrote that down? Why'd you write that? Nope, don't remember anything more about that. You don't remember anything about the context in which that was said to you? I do not. Or what those words mean? No. Do you have any sense of when that was written relative to the rest of these notes? No. Like, did you write that after? Like, did you take all of these notes first and then come back and add a dash on there after the fact? Or did you do it sort of in line? And if you did it in line, why'd you put it off to the side? Why is it sort of like an afterthought? Kind of feels like an afterthought, doesn't it? No idea if it was written 2 minutes into the conversation or later. I don't know. And you never typed those notes up into a formal report, did you? No, not that I recall. And do you remember who you shared this information with? No. And you were asked some questions about the importance of, information and sources. Let me ask you a few questions before we dive into this Alpha Bank stuff. One question is, when information comes into the FBI from human people that we were talking about before, the FBI has the power to reach out to that person, right? And ask some follow-up questions. You call that a clarifying interview when you go back out there, yeah. And the FBI regularly engages in these clarifying interviews. And what did you mean by this? What did you mean by that? It's sort of getting clarity, right? Yeah. And you didn't do that in this case. You didn't interview Sussman, for example, right? He met with Baker and you didn't do one of these clarifying interviews, did you? No. Do you have any idea whether anyone else did? No. And do you have any idea, he says, you were testifying before that there might be information you'd like to know, for example, like motivations about who's providing the information, and the easiest way is to ask somebody, right? To clear that up, right? Yeah. And one other question, he says, you were asked a couple of questions about CHSs, confidential human sources. You talked about the track record of CHSs, and there were rules back then when the FBI can open up different types of investigations. One is a full investigation. You can do it with all your powers. There's also a preliminary investigation, right? And the things you can do in a full investigation are a little different than a preliminary investigation, like getting a wiretap, and there's some differences. Getting a search warrant, getting a special foreign intelligence surveillance court warrant, a FISA warrant, all this stuff, right? There's different types of investigations that allow you to get those things. For the more serious investigations, you can use more serious tools. Is that all true? Yeah. Now, for preliminary investigations, though, if you're going to open an investigation, asks the defense, the rules that apply to investigations say you can open a preliminary where you've got a confidential human source. You remember that? He says, I remember something about that. So the rules about what you do when you have a CHS. Defense gets him to clarify that. Okay, so now we want to get back to Alpha Bank. After that conversation, do you remember talking to senior leaders at the FBI about whether or not to look into these allegations? So after this meeting where he hears about a Kremlin-connected Trump server for the man who's about to be president, remember talking to anybody about that? No. Do you remember talking to senior leaders at the FBI about whether to reach out to media outlets to ask them to hold on a story? Any memory about that? I do not. Defense says, I want to show you another exhibit already been admitted into evidence. This is an email from James Baker at the top. At least is from you. It says James Baker responding to an email from James Baker to you and a bunch of other senior leaders. You see that? Yeah. He says, I'm sorry, even the from and the sent. He says, oh, read it to yourself. Oh, to myself. And then I'll ask you a couple quick questions. Do you remember this email? No. Do you see where it says, for example, on Mr. Baker's email, the reporter on the matter we discussed is Eric Lichtblau. You don't remember actually discussing this with Baker or anyone else, Lichtblau or the emails? He says, I do not. No memory at all. And by the way, Mr. Baker he remembers this one, says that's FBI's general counsel, top lawyer. Yeah. And do you see where it says Mr. Lichtblau is shooting for Sunday? Yes. You don't remember that? No. Okay. Do you remember any conversations you had with Baker in or around this time about the Alpha Bank story? Ever talk to Baker about this? No. Okay. So you don't know, for example, whoever gave you the notes that you took, you didn't follow up with them. You didn't find out more information that they may have gathered. He says, I would have eventually. I don't recall at the time what I did, who gave me the information or what I did with it. So we've got just a useless former FBI agent who can't remember anything. Okay. But he says, but assuming I gave it to somebody to look into, at some point I would have asked what's going on with it, and I would have been apprised of the situation. And the defense says, yeah, sure you would have. It's just amazing. Okay. And the defense says, and that you would have told me whether I needed to do anything, and that would have told you whether you needed to do anything further. Yes, okay. Sure, but to the extent that Mr. Baker's talking about discussions that Baker had with you, you don't remember any discussions with Baker that week about Alpha Bank, right? I do not. So Baker remembers talking to Bill. Bill doesn't remember talking to Baker. Defense asks, as a general matter, if the FBI knew that a newspaper was coming out about a threat from a nation state, would you want to ask the newspaper to hold off on running that story? Bill says yes. Okay, and that's because there are situations where the FBI wants to investigate it before the story comes out. Yes, if the FBI thought, let's say, that this could be a problem, we'd want to have a conversation about it, because when something goes public, bad guys change their behavior. We've talked a lot about this. The defense is using this a lot. They're saying, why would Sussman take this story to the FBI? If Sussman takes this to the FBI is going to shut the story up, and that's going to be harmful to the Hillary Clinton campaign. And he works for the Hillary Clinton campaign. And so why would he do something that goes against his self-interest? He wouldn't, is their point. But we know the opposite of that is true. He was playing both sides of this, taking it to the FBI so that if they launched an investigation, he could take it over to the journalists and say, the FBI is looking into this, therefore it is legitimate. And he takes it to the journalists and says, the FBI is looking into this, so you should run with it. And then he takes that back to the FBI and says, they're about to publish this thing, and so you need now to go and do something about it. So when the FBI squashes it, the journalists say, it's legitimate, and they publish it even harder. And around we go. So the defense asks, as the institution that's trying to protect us, want to get the chance, you want to gather the information about the threat before it goes underground. You want to gather evidence of crimes. And you were asked before about whether or not the FBI opened a formal investigation into Alpha Bank. I'm going to show you another exhibit. Blow this up. It says opening EC. Bill, can you tell us what an opening EC is? Bill says, yeah, I can tell you. It's a document. Well, it's a document that documents the opening of a case. Okay, so here we have an opening EC that relates to an Alpha Bank. It looks like this is dated September 23rd, right? Shortly after the meeting. Yeah. And on the list of the people who were copied at the bottom, looks like we've got Peter Strzok there. You said he's one of the deputy assistant directors, didn't you? Yes. And up on top, we've got Jonathan Maffa. He's another senior leader there, right? Remember anybody else here who was involved? No, I don't remember. And you're not denying that you were. You just don't remember sitting there that day. He says, exactly. No, I'm not denying anything. I just don't remember. Okay, Bill, we're going to introduce something else. Let's blow up this document, 10th line. Bill, these are various messages. Are you familiar with Link? Yeah, and what's Link? He says, well, it's an internal FBI communication system. FBI Link. It's how we talk. So it's like instant messaging for FBI agents? He says, yeah. Great. So they'd like to move the FBI Link and the chain of conversations between several different FBI agents into evidence. So we take a look. We've got Joseph Pientka. Says, you mentioned him a moment ago. That's Washington field agent. We've got Curtis Hyde, which is the Chicago field agent. And this says, people on the 7th floor, to include director, are fired up about this server. Whoa! People on the 7th floor, include the director, are fired up about this server. Now, sitting here, do you remember, well, presumably you've not seen this before. Bill says, no, I haven't seen this. Do you remember the director of the FBI being fired up about the Alpha Bank server? He says, no, I don't. Mr. Pientka says to Mr. Hyde, did you guys open up a case? Did you reach out and put tools on? What does it mean to put tools on, Bill? He says, Bill's like, I guess I want to be careful because when I think of it as classified, but let's just, he says, okay, broadly speaking, something that the FBI can do to investigate. Is that what getting tools means? Put tools on something? I don't know, like illegally spying on all your stuff? Here it says, yeah, putting tools on, yes. Question. Okay. And then he says, Mr. Pientka does, quote, if not, I will call Dan, as Prestep says it's not an option. We must do it. Do you remember communicating to anybody about opening an investigation, about what that being a must do, Bill? Bill says, no, Don't remember. Defense asks, but you're not denying that. You're just saying you don't remember. He says, no, I don't recall that. No. Okay, and what's the reference to the 7th floor? He says, well, that's where the directity and all the top dogs sit. Now, I'd like to just turn your attention to another exhibit that we're going to move. Looks like it's a calendar entry here back on September 23rd. It says it's a meeting. It's got Bill Priestap here. We've got another person named Korten. Who is Korten? He says, oh, that's Mike Korten. At the time, I think he was the assistant director of the public affairs office. Oh, so you've got a meeting here with Korten, Mike Korten. You remember anything about that meeting? No. I'm going to show you another entry. This is another exhibit 707. Another calendar entry. This time it's got Lichtblau, the New York Times reporter, Korten, which is Mike, who is public affairs, and Priestap. Do you know who Lichtblau is? He says it looks like that's a New York Times reporter, but I only know that from a previous email. But sitting here today, you don't know. No, I don't know him. You don't have any view one way or the other. Did you know anything about this meeting, Bill? Do you remember anything? No, I don't remember anything. All right, you were asked about a meeting that took place back at the DOJ on March 6th, and this is another very important meeting. This was the meeting where they were papering over all of their prior mistakes. They got together. Trump had just been elected, sworn in. He's sitting there. Dana Boente at the Oval Office, or wherever they're having this meeting, is sitting around with all of the outgoing Obama people talking about this transition, and they're all saying, oh, yeah, we remember that meeting that Michael Sussman had with the FBI where he said that he was there on behalf of Hillary Clinton. Remember that? Everybody's like, yes, I remember that. We all remember that. Exactly how that happened. Put that in your notes, actually. Write that down. Everybody write that down, because when Trump gets in here, we got to have this documented, okay? Bill, did you write it down? Everybody, okay, good. Now forget it. Forget everything you ever heard about any of this, right? Now, do you remember that meeting? You said you don't remember that meeting. Bill says correct. I'm going to show you another exhibit, and any memory sitting here today, whether you went or didn't go to that meeting. Bill says, no, I can't remember anything. I work at the FBI. When the FBI at senior levels is asked to brief the DOJ about cases, do you do anything to prepare for those meetings, Bill? Yeah. What sorts of things do you do when you're asked to come brief senior DOJ leadership about the status of these cases, like was supposed to happen in this meeting? He says, basically, well, we try to organize the information, organize it like clear and concisely as possible. Gets all his crayons out, make sure the colors are in order and that it's, not coloring outside of the lines. Says, you choose the briefer. All those, you do a variety of prep work. In fact, you're not wasting anybody's time when providing this information. And it's fair to say that you do that prep work so that you're communicating effectively, right? Yes. And accurately. Yes. And fairly. Yes. Bosworth asks, all right, take that down. I've got some final questions there, Bill. Regarding this Alpha Bank investigation, you've said in the time period that this took place, that the FBI was in fact investigating potential connections between Trump and Russia. Is that true back during those months? Yes. And how about the Trump campaign and Russia? Yes. And that was a matter where there was serious national security concerns about, right? Fair to say, yeah. And the FBI viewed that as a national security threat and you investigated it. Yep. Yes, we did. And then you learned about this other allegation about Trump and Alpha Bank. Going to direct you someplace else. Here we're going to talk to page exhibits 19, 20, 21, 22. Bosworth says there are pages of an intelligence memo prepared from the FBI Counterintelligence Division. This came out on September 26. They moved that into evidence, no objection. Bosworth says to Bill, so I'm looking at this memo here. Let's look at page 1. On page 18 up there at the top, it says intelligence memo, FBI in Counterintelligence Division, special project, September 26, 2016. The title is Server in Russia Registered to Alpha Bank Communicating with Trump Organization Server, right? This fake FBI secret counterintelligence memo. Do you see this, Bill? Yes. Bosworth says, okay. And these sorts of intelligence memos are regularly prepared by the Counterintelligence Division, which is where Bill worked on various issues, right, Bill? Yeah. And I'm going to direct your attention to page 20. Can we blow this up? Bill, read that sentence for me. Bill says, happy to. FBI reporting on Alpha Bank and its connection to Russia government officials and Russian intelligence services, RIS. And could you read what else it says on there? And Bill says, I'm sorry, am I reading to myself or out loud? And he says, no, you can read out loud, Bill. And, oh, this is really sweet. Look at this. The defense lawyer is telling Bill, you read very well. He says, no, you can read out loud, Bill. You read very well. That's really nice. So they're getting along over there. We've got some defense attorneys who are being nice to sort of like their little brothers over there at the FBI. Defense attorneys are pretty competent and sophisticated people, I'll say. But he's talking nicely to these FBI. You're doing a great job, kind of patting him on the head. Nice job there, little Billy. So Billy keeps reading very well. He says, thank you, Mr. Bosworth. He says, puts on his big boy pants and he says, so Alpha Group Consortium, also known as Alpha Bank, is one of Russia's largest privately owned investment groups. Open source reporting on Alpha Bank, owned by Alpha Group, identifies Mikhail Friedman, German Khan, Petrin Avin, and Alexei, and it looks like Kuzmikov as its key executives. From 2008 to 15, FBI reporting described ties between Alpha Bank and or key executives and Russian intelligence services. Bill's getting tired, so the defense says, all right, Bill, let me stop you here for a minute. It talks about open source reporting. What is that generally? And Bill says, that's reporting. It's like media reporting. It's available to the general public, and we talk a lot about it. In fact, when we were talking a little bit about some of the World War III stuff, we were getting a lot of our data from people who were, actually gobbling up this information from public sources, public shipping databases, airline databases, where they're tracking all the movements and ebbs and flows of the supply chains. And so that's sort of what they're talking about. The FBI is using the same sources that everybody else is using, apparently. That's what you're talking about. Let's go to the next page. Here, it says that you said that Mikhail Friedman is one of its key executives. In the intelligence memo, you see this here? Yeah. Your intelligence memo says that the president of Alpha Bank for a time maintains a close relationship with who? Vladimir Putin. Do you see that? And this is such a good move by the defense. They know their jurors well. They know that Vladimir Putin, to their DNC panelists there on the jury panel, it's like the worst word that you could possibly say. If anybody did anything to try to stop Putin, it's justified. Doesn't matter what it is. Everything is fair game if it's about stopping Putin. It's the new COVID. So just get used to that. And so the defense is layering this on thick. They've said Vladimir Putin, I don't know, 20 times. How many times have we said it thus far over the last 6 days? A lot. He has nothing to do with this. But the defense keeps bringing him up because they know there are 3 bona fide Democratic donors on the jury. And they're probably petrified with Ukrainian flags all over their Twitter profiles. So they just keep bringing it up. He brings it up again. He says, oh, so Alpha Bank was talking with old Pooty Poo? Yeah, I do. You see that? I do. And Putin, he says, we know, is the leader of Russia, correct? Yes, he is. That's 2 Putins right there. Well done, defense. And in fact, if you look at the next sentence, it says, according to the FBI report, the 2 men, Avin and Putin, that's 3 Putins, were business partners back in the early 1990s. Do you see that? Yeah, I do. So at the time, they take that down. At the time that this allegation came in, and this is what they're doing, they're wrapping this in context. They're saying that Michael Sussman had no choice but to go to the FBI because of Putin, because of the Russians, and because this was a danger to America. So you can see the defense attorney is just framing this. So he says, okay, Bill, let me walk you back through this. At the time that this allegation came in and the counterintelligence investigated it, you were investigating potential connections between Trump and Russia because of this national security threat that it posed, right? Bill says yes. And you've got allegations about another connection between Trump and a Russian bank that had Trump and Russia on the payroll. He says, according to this memo, yeah. And that's something the FBI is going to investigate then, right? Yeah, because it's your job to figure out if this information is true or false, right? Yes. And you talked and you looked at a variety of factors to figure out if you're going to investigate something. But given this kind of threat, given what's at stake, and given what else you know about the relationship between Trump and Russia and Alpha Bank, you're going to have to investigate something with the FBI. He says, are you saying like this meets our threshold? He says, well, is that a topic that you regard as a serious national security threat? He says, yeah. And the only way to figure out whether the allegations are true or false is by investigating, right? Yes, that's true. Bosworth says, thank you. And so really trying to frame this out as though Michael Sussman was a reasonable person, and if anything, the lie was just a little immaterial lie, and it was not even consequential at all. And he was highly justified in being freaked out because everybody was freaked out because apparently Trump was not doing anything. Who knows? Anyway, so we get a brief redirect now. This is the government prosecutor. It's short. Normally we don't cover the redirects, but we'll cover this one because it is very short. Prosecutor gets back up and he says, all right, Bill. Says, you testified on direct that you had an understanding that the FBI did, in fact, open an investigation into the Alfa Bank. You said that when I first started talking to you. FBI opened an investigation into Russia, Trump, Alfa Bank. Bill says, yes, according to the electronic communication, that looks like an opening. That looks like a document that signifies the opening of a case on this. Like, we did open this up. And what was your understanding of the result of that investigation? He says, look, again, only a vague recollection, but if I recall correctly, not much came out of it, meaning I guess I'd call it fizzled out. Prosecutor says, thank you, no further questions. Right? And that's what the prosecutor wanted. He wanted them to say, yeah, it's a garbage, useless investigation that went nowhere. Because that's what the next witness is going to talk about. Court says, all right, Bill, thanks for your testimony. Get off the bench. Don't talk about the case anymore. Have a good day. And Your Honor then asks the question, who's next? Call your next witness, prosecutors. And they do. DeFilippis is now back up and he says, Your Honor, the government calls another FBI agent, Ryan Gaynor, who now comes and takes the stand. Now, I don't have a photograph of this guy, but this looks like an FBI agent that might resemble Ryan Gaynor. I don't know. Well, let's take a quick feeling parched drink break. Cheers. And we can see this is our second witness. And let's see what page we're on. We're at about page 64 of 169. But remember the last about 15 pages are all index pages. So yeah, we're a little under halfway there. But this witness has a lot of direct exam that we'll attend to. So let's see what happens here. We've got, and remember this guy is a new witness. We have him here on day 6. And he gives us some additional names. We mentioned this at the start of the show. Here, we've got Curtis Heide, Allison Sands, Section Chief Maffa, David Dagon. And we're going to learn a lot more about these people as we continue to go on. And let's see what we've got here. Okay. Government prosecutor DeFilippis calls up the FBI special agent. Good morning, sir. How are you? Can you spell your name for us? And he does successfully. Says, sir, where do you work? I'm over here at the Norfolk field office. And what's your position? Well, he says, I'm a special agent in charge of national security. And what do you do there as a special agent? He says, well, I'm responsible for the entirety of the field office. And then a special agent in charge has assistant special agents in charge. And we cover criminal and national security and all that stuff. What sort of work have you done when you were at the FBI? All sorts of stuff. National security, working terrorism, counterintelligence, and human. I've been all over the place. I started my career in St. Louis, then I came to DC. Back in 2016, I was assigned as a unit chief within the counterintelligence division working on infrastructure protection, maybe like elections. And where was that? Was that in DC? He says, yeah, that was in DC at our headquarters. Now, prosecutor asks, sir, you're an FBI special agent, aren't you? Yeah. Was there a time in 2016 when you learned about some allegations about Donald Trump, the Trump organization, and a Russian bank called Alfa Bank? Did you come across those allegations? Ryan Gaynor says, yes. When was that? He says, so I learned about the allegation on Alfa Bank around September 23rd, which was a Friday of 2016. Very, very precise FBI agent. September 23rd, which was a Friday of 2016. Sun was shining and the wind was blowing in an easterly direction. Now, how did you first learn about the allegation? So he says, I attended a briefing where I heard the allegation described. And who was giving that briefing? That was in the Chicago field office. There was a video conference call with our headquarters, and Chicago was doing the briefing. You said you think that meeting was about September 23rd, which was a Friday, you said? Yeah. And what, if anything, did you do in response to hearing that briefing? He said, well, I heard it, and I offered Supervisory Agent Joe that I'd be calling and willing to track that for our front office. I would be willing to do that. I'll take this case over. What do you mean by continuing to track it for your front office? And Special Agent Ryan says, by front office, I'm referring to the senior leadership within the counterintelligence division. By track it, I mean that they had already initiated an investigation, and it seemed like it was going to be relatively straightforward. So I offered to help Mr. Pientka by continuing to brief on that front. In other words, I'll take that assignment. I volunteer for this case. Who was Mr. Pientka? You said Joseph? He says, yeah, so Joseph was a supervisory special agent. He was at the headquarters at that time. And you said you'd volunteered to work on the case. He says, I did volunteer. What happened from there? Did you speak with any agents, or did you go to Chicago that they were already working on this? What happened? He says, yeah, I did. It was, I believe the same day I went over there. And during those discussions, I learned further details about the allegations and the material that the investigative team had already collected. And remember, these were the thumb drives. These are the documents that Michael Sussman brought and landed on Mr. Baker's desk. Jim Baker, general counsel for the FBI, took place at that meeting. He landed there and just said, I've got all this stuff back here at this meeting. James Baker said, I don't want anything to do with any of this. Remember, he handed it off to other people at the FBI, who then passed it along to the Chicago field office, and others started to look at the thumb drives and look at the white papers and dissect it and say, doesn't really add up. So they asked this agent, and did you talk to Mr. Pientka that day, your supervisor, or just interact at the meeting? What happened with him? He says, so I talked to Mr. Pientka that morning, and I believe I IM'd him later that day. And then after that, I don't believe we had any further conversations. I was talking really with the investigative team. Do you recall the name of the Chicago agents or the agents that you spoke to there at the beginning of the investigation? Yeah, we had Curtis Heide and Special Agent Allison Sands, who comes in this afternoon. And we're not going to talk about Allison Sands today, but we'll talk about her tomorrow. But you see how they're layering these people. It's sort of one FBI agent after another. This guy's going to lay some foundation and groundwork. Allison Sands will be the follow-up connection. And other than describing the allegations, anyone else you recall, say Mr. Hyde saying or describing or asking you of anything? He says, so other than describing the allegation, Mr. Heide and I believe that Sands sent me documents related to the case. That was on a Friday, right? Yeah. And when was the next time? He says, let me strike that. In preparation for your testimony, have you had a chance to look at documents, records, or emails? Special agent says, I have. So did you remember all of this before you looked at those documents and records, or have you refreshed your recollection? He says, I had to refresh my recollection. So the date, the exact time, for example, is that something you reminded yourself of from the documents? You got the clarity on that? He says, it was. It's been 4 to 5 years. Okay, and so you learned about this on a Friday, and then when was the next time you said you spoke to somebody about the case? He says, so the next time that I spoke about the case was on the following Monday. Do you recall any questions that Agent Hyde asked of you, given that you were going to handle this case from a headquarters perspective or not at that time? Any clarifying questions? He says, yeah, Heidi asked if I could find out who or where these allegations had come from. Where these white papers and random thumb drives just come from? What the heck are these doing on my desk? Prosecutor says, okay. And now we're at Monday. We're now back after September 23rd when you had that meeting. We're now on September 26th. You following me? Yeah, correct. And what happened on that day, as far as you can recall, with relation to your role in the case on that Monday? Gaynor says, so that Monday, I went to ask Mr. Prietka, if feels like a 5th grade teacher, if he knew where the information had come from that initiated the case in Chicago. Did you know where this came from? And I ended up speaking with the section chief about this named Maffa. And so when you asked Mr. Pientka, did he respond in any way, or did he just sort of refer you out? He says, I don't remember if I even ran into Mr. Pientka. I believe I ran into, or he said, I might have met with Mr. Maffa first. As best you recall, where did that meeting take place here, Ryan? I don't recall the specific room. I believe it would have been in the Chief Maffa's office, likely maybe at FBI headquarters. As best you can recall, Ryan, anybody else in the meeting? He says, I don't remember anyone else in the meeting, but that doesn't preclude someone else from having been there. I just don't remember them there. And what happened in the meeting then with Mr. Maffa? Now that you're talking about, where'd this come from? He says, and he starts a lot of his paragraphs with so, right? So that's why I'm doing that, and I do that too. So, in meeting with Section Chief Maffa, I informed him of what had gone on the prior Friday because he'd been out of work. And after doing so, I also informed him that I had volunteered to assist in the Alpha Bank matter, briefing it to the front office. And did you have any further discussions about the case? Yeah. And what was the nature of those discussions? Here, Ryan says, so I recall that Mr. Moffa informed me that the allegation had come from, dun, 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 Michael Sussman. And what, if anything, did he say about who Mr. Sussman had provided that information to? So my understanding, he says, from the meeting with him was that he had provided that information to James Baker, general counsel for the FBI, who was the general counsel. And what, if anything, did he say about Mr. Sussman? Any work he might do or anything in that regard? Did he give you more details on Michael Sussman and where he came from? He says, so I wrote on my briefing sheet that he noted that he was an attorney for the DNC or a DNC attorney. He may have said more during the meeting. I just don't remember what that is at this time. Prosecutor asks, and when he said that Mr. Sussman was an attorney for the DNC, what impression did you come away with? What did you understand that to mean? Gaynor says, I understood that to mean that he had been affiliated with the Democratic Party, but that he had come representing himself. Ooh. Okay. And what if, recognizing it's been a long time, any specifics that contributed to that understanding, or do you not recall that sitting here today? Asks the prosecutor. FBI special agent says, well, we have Bill here. Bill's not the special. This is them sitting here today, 5 years later. I don't recall specifically other information that came out, but I do recall that meeting with the impression that he'd been associated with the Democratic Party. He was a DNC attorney, but that wasn't the reason for him bringing the material forward. And what, if anything, asks the prosecutor, did Moffa tell you about whether you could share the fact that Sussman was involved with others? Did he say anything about that? He did. And what did he say? Moffa said he informed me that our senior leadership had put what's called a close hold on the material. What is a close hold? Which meant that the specific information about who had provided the allegation could not be provided to the field. What? The FBI knows that this came from Michael Sussman. The FBI knows that Michael Sussman is very close with the DNC, somebody who worked for many other entities, DNC connected. We've talked about that in prior videos here. And James Baker receives this stuff before he hands it over to Bill. Bill and others hand it off to other FBI agents who send it out for analysis. The analysts get the documents, and the analysts are now wondering, where'd this stuff come from? Because it might be problematic. It might be a conflict of interest. We might not like the source here. And when they go to find out where it came from, they learn that the senior top brass said, you can't figure that out. You don't get to find out where it came from because we have a close hold on it, which meant the specific information is not provided to the field. Prosecutor asks, and when you say senior leadership, was it any more specific than that, or did you just mean senior leadership? He says, at this point, I just remember being senior leadership, most senior leadership at the Bureau that had come in through Mr. Baker. The information had come in through Mr. Baker. It already came in at the top level, which is why they did that. So that they could do whatever they wanted with it. If it would have come in through a regular special agent field office at the bottom, they would have said, this is dog garbage, get it out of here. But they knew that Baker would do something with it, which is why Sussman went through him. Question, and what, if anything, were you asked to do in relation to the case, and specifically that so-called close hold? What were your tasks? He says, I was asked to determine, based on the information that I had, what I learned from the team, if that close hold was helping or hindering the investigation. If the close hold itself was helping or hindering the Chicago investigation, says the prosecutor, he says, yeah. Prosecutor asks, so what, if anything, so does that take us to the end of the meeting with Moffa? Anything else you recall about this meeting? He says, no, that's about the end of that meeting. And generally speaking, what was your role on this case? If you were at headquarters and that case was being investigated out of FBI Chicago, you're in a whole different part of the country. How are you investigating that? FBI agent says, so the case had a program management team in place. My role, as I viewed it, was a liaison, and that I would be able to provide information of brief and kind of common terms, language that they would understand, to our leadership team, what the technical aspects of this investigation meant. So he's sort of like a translator. He's going to say, oh, these are what the computer people say. This is what the director, the intelligence so-called, directors need to hear, and he translates it between the two. And let me ask you this, says the prosecutor. Do you have a significant cyber experience, or were you someone who dealt with cyber jargon a lot? He says, well, I didn't have significant cyber experience. I was in the FBI's technically trained agent program, and I did maintain enterprise-grade equipment in our field offices. So I have an understanding of the technology, and I'd spent the last few years working on infrastructure matters related to this type of threat. And asked, well, what's the status of this effort at the time that you met with MAFA? In other words, what had the Chicago office done? When you had this meeting, how far along was this? FBI special agent says, so at that point, the FBI had initiated an investigation through the Chicago field office. The initial allegation had been reviewed by our ECOL, which is the European Cyber Operations Unit, and they had produced an analysis of our findings related to the allegation. And the field office had also reached out to the first company, Central Dynamics, to initiate an effort to gather logs, additional logs. I believe they also had potentially collected initial logs related to a spam filter that was in place by Barracuda for the company. Okay, so you say that the company at issue, did you say Central Dynamics? Yeah. And what, if any, understanding did you have about their role in these allegations? FBI agent says, so my understanding was and is that Central Dynamics was a marketing firm, and that the email addresses or email domain, the server domain, if you will, that's associated with this case was one that they had potentially used. Prosecutor says, so was the idea to get technical data that might help the FBI find an answer to the allegation? Yes. So if the allegation was a covert communication system, we could look for covert communication that we would be able to see via the logs that the U.S. companies had in their possession. So is it your testimony then, asks the prosecutor, that after the meeting with MAFA, your supervisor, essentially the field office was waiting to gather or receive further information from the company? Just waiting around? Yeah. My initial assessment, which I made on that prior Friday in a write-up, was that we were essentially waiting for the logs from Central Dynamics to make an assessment of whether or not there was a covert communication system. Essentially, if the firms aren't talking to each other or the emails aren't talking to each other, then there isn't one. Now, you said you were tasked to figure out whether the so-called close hold was helping or hindering the investigation. Did you come to an initial view on that? I did. And what was that view? And what was the reason you came to that view? Special Agent Gaynor says, I came to the conclusion that if the object was whether or not we were hindering the investigation with that close hold, that since we were waiting on logs to determine whether or not an actual threat allegation, or rather a threat existed, that it wasn't hindering that investigation, or at least I couldn't argue that there wasn't a compelling reason why they needed to pull the hold at the time. So did you communicate that back to MAFA? I believe I did. Now, Mr. Gaynor, what else at this time, what if anything else did the FBI do or begin to do to investigate these allegations as best as you recall? He says, so there were several efforts underway. We've already mentioned Chicago field office is waiting on Central Dynamic logs. We received the analysis from our European counterparts. Says we've done an initial review of the Barracuda firewall spam filter, determined that the spam filter made it pretty clear, even though they weren't complete logs, that while there had been 15 communications, 14 of them inbound had been blocked. One outbound communication had been attempted but blocked. And as a result, the Barracuda logs seemed to indicate there wasn't a covert system, although incomplete. Okay, so additionally, the special agent in Chicago, Allison Sands, conducted a review of the data herself and made determinations related to the allegations that the Tor node that was mentioned within the allegation did not pass analytical muster. It didn't have merit. Later, she would make other analysis, including that the Central Dynamics logs themselves did not show a covert communication system. We also initiated a liaison contact with Mandiant, and through that liaison contact, we determined that they had independently come to the conclusion that the allegation lacked merit as well. So 0 for 3. Prosecutor says, love it. Let's break that down and come back to some of it. When you talk about Barracuda filters, what is that? He says, look, essentially through Central Dynamics, he says, even though Central Dynamics is themselves a marketing firm that sends out email campaigns similar to spam, they also suffer from being spammed themselves. And the court cuts him off and says, hey, special agent, slow down there a little bit. Our court reporter's struggling. We have the best court reporters. Always talk slowly for your court reporters. The witness says, I apologize, Your Honor. And he backs up. He says, all right, look, so Barracuda is a company, in this case, that was used to try and prevent Central Dynamics and their service provider from being spammed themselves, even though they sent out spam. So essentially, the Barracuda firewall would prevent them from being the victims of spam attacks. And the prosecutor says, okay, and how, if at all, is that firewall or its data relevant to this FBI investigation? What are we talking about spam here for? He says, well, because data that would have had to traverse this covert communication would have necessarily had to traverse the firewall as well. Traverse. So it has to get across. If it's got to go through the wall. If they're actually communicating, if Trump is actually getting instructions from Putin, it's pretty useless if his firewall is blocking it at the gate. Okay, so it's the data source for the FBI to look at. And the special agent says it was. They go on a break. Judge says, ladies and gentlemen, it's our morning break. Why don't you go out there, use the restroom, text your loved one, have a snack, and come back in here ready to listen. They take their 15 minutes. They're back at 11 a.m. They're back here now. And Prosecutor DeFilippis goes back to it. He says, all right, Mr. Special Agent, just going back to a couple things we testified about here before. You mentioned this close hold that the FBI leadership had imposed on the Sussman case. You recall that? He says, yeah, I do. And he says, what reason did you receive for that close hold? Which again, is them not telling the agents where it came from. It's not being sourced. It's a close hold. We're keeping it close to the chest. And there might be good reasons for that. What if somebody is a confidential human source and they provide the information? You don't want to say, oh, it came over from Rob Govea, who's deep undercover, right? It's a close hold. There's a good reason for it. And he says, you know, if I was given a reason at the time, I do not remember what it was. Okay, you recall having several meetings with the special counsel's office here, Durham, and these prosecutors looking over these matters? Yeah. And when you first met with the government, was the close hold something you recalled, or did the government tell you about it? He says, no, I didn't tell the government about it. He says, well, what was the reason for that? He said, I don't remember. I did not recall that there was a close hold in place at the time that we had our first meeting. And after that meeting, did you get a chance to go back and look at what you said? Like, did you look at records and documents and emails and things? I did. And to what extent did all of that refresh your recollection? He says, yeah, it actually did jog my memory about this close hold issue. He says, yeah, it had been several years since the actual event. Between when we met and when these events occurred, looking at the material helped me to reconstruct and remember and refresh my recollection on the chain of events, and specifically a to-do list allowed me to recall the close hold itself. So this guy's on point. You know, this guy sort of has to-do lists and calendars, and he kind of remembers some things. And if he doesn't remember it, he's got other things that will refresh his recollection. Jim Baker and Bill Priestap should learn a little something from this special agent who actually comports himself with a little bit more discipline. So the prosecutor says, okay, so a to-do list that you prepared, huh? Yeah, correct. Now, let me ask you this, special agent. You mentioned that when you finished your meetings with Maffa back on September 26, you had the impression that Sussman represented the DNC in other matters, but that he wasn't there for the DNC. Is that fair? Is that a fair summary here? Yeah. And now your recollection on that issue has been refreshed, has it not? Yes, it has. And when you first met with the government, was that clear in your mind? Did you have that memory? No, I didn't actually. And which aspects of your preparation jogged your memory? He says it was a document review, specifically the to-do list. Okay, but the prosecutor says specifically, when you testified, says your impression was that Sussman had not come to the FBI. Was that something that became clear in your mind more recently or closer to when you met with the government? So they're trying to talk about his memory because the defense is going to beat him up over this. And the prosecutor asks, you know, you had meetings with the government where you talked about Sussman as a DNC attorney. And the prosecutor finally gets over that a little bit. Okay. So he says, now, so I think we were talking about Barracuda servers before the break. You remember that? Yeah. Do you recall a time when you got the logs from Central Dynamics? Yes, he does. They say, perfect. I want to introduce this email chain as an exhibit now. Sir, can you please read the to line on this email? What does it say? He says, so in the to line, it goes to Supervisory Agent Daniel Wierzbicki, and then we've got Special Agent Curtis Hyde and Special Agent Allison Sands. No objection to that being introduced, and it is. He now asks him to go down to the top page of the email. Says, in the second page, who is Curtis Hyde? He says he's a special agent, one of them assigned to investigate the Alpha Bank matter, along with Special Agent Sands. So we've got two new special agents who are now involved in the underlying investigation, Sands and Curtis Heide. These two people are now involved, right? They're sort of, Allison Sands, we know, is going to be called as a witness very soon. DeFilippis says, okay, can we bring up the header for the email? And now it spans 2 pages. They're reading through it. Let's go to the body of the email. Can you read this? He says, yeah, we got the logs from MM. What is the MM? It's a field abbreviation for the Miami field office. And there it says, quote, so we'll look through those for these IPs. Quote, we really want to interview, quote, the source of all this information. Any way we can track down who this guy is and how we're getting this information, Curtis. They're really trying to find out who Michael Sussman is. Prosecutor says, well, what does this all mean? The logs from Miami means the logs we got from Central Dynamics. Same thing as the spam marketing company. And when you say that we got to look for these IPs, what are IPs? He says, well, we might have to go through the email chain, but there's several different IPs in there, 3 of them, all associated with Alpha Bank. I'd have to refresh my recollection to look at the chain, but they move on. They say another sentence in that email is, we really want to interview the source. What did you understand that to mean? Special Agent Ryan Gaynor says, well, Curtis had asked, I believe, on the Friday when I joined the investigation if we could determine who this was, and he was still asking about it. But you said you weren't in a position to tell him about that, right? Yeah, I was waiting for the results of the logs. And so it looks like on the same day some of those logs came in that Curtis sort of re-raised the question, right? Curtis wanted to know where it came from. He couldn't figure that out. Logs came in and he re-raised this question. We'd really like to know where it came from. Is that fair? He says, yes, it is. They go on to the next email on the chain. They talk about this guy, Daniel Wizerbicki. Who is this? Well, this is a supervisory special agent. He's over there in Chicago. He's got an email back from October 3rd. And this is like this is early, last 4 or 5 weeks up until the election. October 3rd. Could you read to the jury what Agent Wizerbicki said? He says, okay. And he reads, quote, I agree with Curtis. An interview with the source of info would be the logical step in this, as well as any investigation. It may allow us to understand the what and the why of the white paper. Agent Ryan, what did this mean to you when you read this? He said that Heide was supporting Curtis's request and they were trying to determine the source of the information. We get another email finally, top email in the chain, October 4th, the next day. Any reason you didn't respond on the same day? He says, so I do know that afternoon I had a meeting with the criminal division to discuss a separate related matter. But he says, but the reason for my TDY is temporary duty at the FBI. And so that's why he's a little bit delayed on that. I think you've testified about this, special agent. It says, at the time the Alpha Bank case started, you were on temporary duty. Is that fair? Yeah. What is it that you say in response to Wizerbicki and Heidi's emails? So now Special Agent Gaynor is responding, saying, got it. And being discussed at the HQ. And remember, these two guys sent him an email saying, we need to know where this came from and who this guy is. Who is Michael Sussman? Where did these white papers come from? He responds. He says, got it. We're discussing this at headquarters. Before we make any decision on that front, we're going to need to know what we can learn from the logs we have now obtained and the nature of the actual activity between Alpha Bank and the domain. CG is the FBI abbreviation for Chicago Field Office. MM is for Miami. Says, have done great work on this. It's very much appreciated. We continue to highlight the progress on this matter, and we're going to talk about this on a daily basis. And he breaks this down. When you said it was being discussed at HQ, what did you say? He says, well, we're waiting the logs. When you said got it, what did you mean? Say, got it, meaning we're looking for a source of where the allegation came from. And when you said that they were discussing this at HQ, what did you mean, agent? He says, I was signaling both that headquarters was aware and also that I had information in my own possession. And they ask him, Mr. Special Agent, so now that we've got all this, you've got your 2 special agents who are asking and demanding to know where this came from. Did you go back to Mr. Maffa to check on whether this close hold was lifted? Are you able to go and tell them now? I don't remember going back to Maffa to ask that this be lifted because I was waiting, I believe, for a log to review. And the prosecutor says, so it looks like then on October 3rd and 4th, as best you can recall without getting into these, what did those logs show? So the prosecutor was sort of taking him on this meandering tour and said, did you go and ultimately get that close hold lifted? Were you able to go and source some of this stuff? Never got there because those logs came in. Oh, let's talk about the logs. How did the investigation proceed from there? Well, he says, Special Agent Sands, who testified on this same day, but in the afternoon, so she'll be the next witness that comes out. She conducted an analysis of the logs, and I believe the logs came in as early as Monday of the week. Upon her review, she informed me that the logs did not indicate that there was a covert communication system. They didn't support the allegation, obviously. In addition, I mentioned earlier at the same time, we learned that Mandiant had done an independent assessment and determined that there wasn't a reason to believe that the allegations had merit. So the prosecutor says, okay, well, that's the third one. So I guess we'll just talk about that one. Who is Mandiant? He says it's a respected cybersecurity firm. Are they based in the US? Yeah. And are they fairly prominent? Yes. And now, what was their role in this allegation? He says, well, without looking at my notes, I believe they were actually hired by Alpha Bank to take a look. So Alpha said, you come and look at us. To take a look at whether there was actually a channel between Trump and Russia? Yeah, they hired him. And so did the Bureau become aware that Mandiant, a prominent U.S. cyber firm, was looking at the allegation? Yeah, we knew that. And what did the Bureau do, if anything, to figure out what Mandiant's conclusions were? Somebody else was looking into this. He says, my understanding is the field office discreetly reached out to an employee of Mandiant to talk about their findings. Because the FBI can't do their own homework, right? They can't do it. They got to go talk to the other kid who's smarter than them and say, hey, what'd you get on number 7? Oh, yeah, that's what I got too. You B, yeah, I got B. Yeah, no question about that. Yeah, fake, right? Not real, no, not justified. No conspiracy. That's what we got too. I just wanted to make sure that you guys were doing things right over there at Mandiant. So some FBI employees like, excuse me, what'd you guys find over there? Oh my gosh. Okay, so they figure out Mandiant does the hard work and they're like, no, there's nothing there, idiots. And they go, okay, perfect, thanks. And so what happened from there? So Special Agent Gaynor says, well, I know that as of October 5th, I believe it was, that based on those discussions, we had learned that they had independently determined the allegations didn't have merit, or that the allegation rather didn't have merit. So Mandiant, you said, is a U.S. firm, but they had been hired by a Russian bank. Did the FBI had reason to trust Mandiant's conclusion there? Do you know? Like, was that legitimate? He says, I would assess that any for-profit organization can have a potential ulterior motive. But what they found was consistent with what we found, so it just seemed to be corroborating, but not definitive. So it was corroborating of our finding that there was no covert communication system. Well done. Okay, now you're familiar with the concept, Special Agent, of a confidential human source. Do you know what those are? He says, yes. In connection with this investigation, did the FBI receive any confidential human source reporting that was relevant to this allegation? He says, we did. Oh. Could you describe that briefly to the jury there, Agent Gaynor? He says, so the FBI, through our Chicago field office, received confidential human source reporting that indicated that a CHS believed the allegation had merit and that this particular story allegation had been provided to media outlets. So it sounds like we may have a CHS here who has not been uncovered yet. Who could this be? So the source told the FBI that this allegation had been given to media outlets. Right? They did. And was this confidential human source, to your knowledge, it was not Mr. Sussman, is that correct? To the best of my knowledge, it was not Mr. Sussman. Well, then who could it be? Okay. And that confidential human source asked the prosecutor when he or she told the FBI that the media had these allegations. What, if anything, do you recall the Chicago squad or the FBI doing about that? He says the Chicago field office passed questions that were given to the CHS, and the CHS provided answers related to various aspects of the allegation. So you've got the FBI talking with the CHS about all these allegations now that have been confirmed to be garbage through Mandiant and many others. And then they reevaluated Chicago. Chicago evaluated the CHS response and didn't believe that the CHS was correct. They thought the CHS was wrong. And why? What were the reasons? They say they actually listed out multiple reasons. Probably the best, though, was an exhibit that we could refresh my recollection with bringing up if you need to. He says, okay, I can do that. But generally speaking, do you recall why? What was the thrust of why the FBI didn't believe the conclusions of the source to be accurate? Why? He said, well, the source made several technical assertions that didn't pass analytical merit. Pretty simple. It's just not technically possible. Okay. Prosecutor wants to explore this, rightfully so. Says, okay, are you familiar with the name David Dagon? Yeah. Who is that? Says, during the investigation, David Dagon came up. He was a professor over at Georgia Tech. And how does the name pop up into this thing? Says the confidential human source was reporting on David Dagon. Oh. And did he say whether Mr. Dagon had any particular role in this allegation or subject matter? He said, yeah, he did. What was that? So David Dagon, says FBI agent Special Gaynor, the CHS agent alleged that David Dagon was the potential author of the white paper itself, the researcher over at Georgia Tech. Okay, says the prosecutor. And I think the jury's heard the testimony that there may have been several white papers given to the FBI. Was the idea that he was the author of one or more of them? Says yes. Now, did the FBI go and interview Dagon? As far as you know? As far as I know, no. And what, if anything, was the reason for that? Well, the FBI in our headquarters and the field office concurred. They determined the allegation lacked merit. That based on what we had on hand, that there was not a covert communication system. And the decision was made that doing an overt interview of an individual so close to the election could inadvertently impact the potential election, and as a result, could be a potential violation of policy. Also, it was not the least intrusive technique available to us to make any assertion about Dagon's knowledge. Prosecutor says, all right, so you said an overt interview and then mentioned the fact that there was an election year. What do you mean by an overt interview? He says, well, at the FBI, an overt interview would be going out publicly to talk to somebody in their everyday capacity. He says there are policies about doing that during an election season there at the FBI. He says, yes. And generally speaking, what are those policies? He said, well, they're pretty clear that the spirit of the policy is that we shouldn't conduct an investigative activity overtly that could impact an election in an election year. And we may have to wait until after the election if the investigative step is still necessary. So you don't do it unless maybe it's going to eliminate Donald Trump, who the rules don't apply to because he's everybody's political enemy. Anyways, prosecutor says, okay, how, if at all, did that affect your decision to interview Dagon? That you had heard from the source that folks were talking to the media on this. Did it impact you? It does. He says the FBI has a policy related to First Amendment protected speech. One of the key aspects of the First Amendment is that we're not allowed to engage in overt activity that could dissuade people from engaging in First Amendment protected speech, which is all total garbage, as we know, because the DOJ and the FBI, we played the clips here of both of them announcing their new homegrown domestic violent extremism task forces, where they're going to join hands, the DOJ and the FBI, the prosecutors and the law enforcement agents, hand in hand together to go and eliminate homegrown domestic violent extremism, which is the new thing that they just created out of thin air, which of course tramples all over the Constitution and the First Amendment. Essentially, says this FBI agent, we're not supposed to conduct activity that might cause a person not to do First Amendment stuff. And so in this case, both Mr. Dagon and the CHS were engaged with the media, which is a form of protected speech. Now, at the time, asked the prosecutor, do you have any idea one way or not whether Dagon was in touch with Sussman? He says, at the time, the closest information I had that potentially Sussman had been in touch with Dagon would have been a work in progress paper that had been passed back and forth to a DC attorney. That DC attorney could have been Sussman. Did you draw that connection at the time? He says, I don't remember drawing that connection. They open up another email. This email is from this agent and from Peter Strzok. Any objection to this email? Can you tell me what date of this email is here, says the prosecutor? He says, yeah, October 5th. This is a couple days after the logs came back in from Miami, isn't it? And he says, well, they actually came back October 3rd, so I would have had them by then. And this email comes from somebody named Mark Hasenball. Who is that? He says, I'd assume he's with Reuters. Looks like he's a national security correspondent down there on the signature line. And there's somebody else on this email, FBI Public Affairs. And can you read what this says? This is the email from Hasenball from Reuters. This email says, quote, "The information below, supposedly posted by private computer experts, suggests some kind of transactions through a secret data channel hidden between Alpha Bank and Russia and a supposed hidden Donald Trump organization data server. It has been suggested to me that this information and scenario is under careful investigation by the FBI." What can you tell me about this? Many thanks. So Reuters is pumping the FBI for information. Sussman's plan is all coming together. Prosecutor asks FBI agent Gaynor, says, "Do you have a reason to know one way or another how Hasenball would know about this at all?" He says, "I knew that the European Cyber Operations Unit had been aware that Reuters was looking into this, but I don't believe Reuters was one of the outlets that I was aware that CHS, Dagon, or Sussman had reached out to. And they weren't listed anywhere. So Sussman had somebody had reached out to this other new agency called Reuters. We had seen previously in Bill's notes, right? Bill's notes are here. What did he write down? Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, or New York Times, but not Reuters. There's no Reuters on here in this middle sentence. Prosecutor says, okay, there's another email from Jordan Kelly. Who is that? Somebody over with the cyber division. And CYD means cyber division within our FBI operation. We got another email. This one comes from Eric Spory. Who is he? He was the DAD, Deputy Assistant Director, and it looks like Peter Strzok forwards the email over to him. Peter Strzok is the Deputy Assistant Director of Counterintelligence, one of the FBI lovers. Do you recall someone named Bill? He says, yeah, Bill was the Assistant Director, and it falls right underneath, going through the hierarchy here. There's another email chain. Says here, this site provides neutral factual DNS data. They're looking at the Trump email server, mail1.trumpemail.com. And another couple emails they're referencing. Another email to Daniel. Here we go. Could you read this part of this email minus the redacted parts? We have Chicago referenced here. It says, quote, "I am interested in your thoughts on the attached paper. This was found online at an address on MediaFire. It looks like the argument of this paper is largely supported by activity likely caused by our investigation and other acts by Redacted. I would like your technical opinion on this paper. Is this related to Trump's email domain server? As always, thank you for your great work on this. Signed, Ryan." Mr. Gaynor, is this what you were referring to when you said that at some point you passed this along? Yes. What, if anything, do you remember about the outcome of this? I don't remember the outcome. If there's an exhibit to refresh my recollection, I can look at it, but the prosecutor doesn't want to show him. He says, but to be fair on this, what do you recall generally about the outcome of the Alpha Bank investigation? He says, generally, the outcome of the investigation was there was no covert communication system, as spelled out in the white paper. That's it. They said there was, there isn't. And how long did you remain on the investigation? He says, I believe on Friday, September 23rd, my temporary duty actually ended mid-November, but my primary duty was working on election infrastructure, which was a significant national security threat. And it went all the way through that time period. And then I took on, towards the end, threats via social media. My primary duty was threats to the election infrastructure. Phased off in November. And he was basically closed the investigation January of 2017. Now, Mr. Gaynor, you testified you knew Sussman worked with the DNC. Yeah. And your impression was that he was not doing this for a client, right? And if Sussman had been billing his time on these matters or being paid by the DNC, would that have mattered to you? He says, yes. If he had been paid, it would have been a concern. Why? He says, while the investigation was already initiated when I joined, I think that information would have had an impact when they were making considerations for opening prior or joining, whether opening investigations or prior to my joining, and it would have impacted whether I would have been involved in this investigation. Prosecutor's going to break this down, talking about the different types of investigations. He talks about the different levels of FBI investigations. This information, he says, may have changed whatever senior leadership in Chicago wanted to do. And you're basing this on your experience? Yes, I am. Now, when you say that it might have affected the close hold and your view of the close hold, what do you mean? I mean, if there was information that wasn't known to leadership at the time about where the information came from, maybe they wouldn't have put a close hold in place in the first place. And he says, if I had been informed that the individual was motivated by what you described, it would have changed how I viewed the close hold. Now, I wanted to share this. We're going to speed up a little bit. This goes to materiality. So this entire conversation is about materiality. Remember, one of the defense arguments is that this was not a consequential lie. This is not really that relevant. Michael Sussmann went in there and had a conversation with the FBI about a serious national security threat. Whether he brought that information on behalf of Hillary Clinton or not doesn't matter. A national security threat's a national security threat no matter whether Tom, Dick, or Harry told you about it, right? And so here they're saying, no, it is critically important to investigating that national security threat. Why? Prosecutor asks him, if you were to learn or hear that Sussmann was working on behalf of a client who had business interests with the FBI, would that have mattered? Why? Yes. He says yes. So a person associated with one political party or another doesn't necessarily infringe upon the allegations, but being financially motivated to bring an allegation to the FBI is something that should be taken into account. And he might have changed his investigation, including whether to open it or not. Says there are different levels of investigations, but we have some pre-assessment work to do. We have preliminary work, we have preliminary investigations, and then we have full investigations. And depending on that level, we got to open the right, depending on what we know, depending on the data, we have to then make a decision on what type of investigation to open. Prosecutor asks him now, if you were to learn that Sussmann brought this information on behalf of somebody who was already a confidential human source, would that have mattered? Yes, it would have. He says a confidential human source, one of the things we want to do is protect their engagement with the government. So the fact that a CHS would have provided that information means that we would need to determine how to handle that information to protect this person. And if they went through another party, the question might be why they didn't do it directly through the Bureau. Why go around the regular chain of command, in other words? And then I think we're getting to the final question here, kind of a long, drawn-out direct. It says, finally, Special Agent Gaynor, you said that these kinds of factors might have affected whether you would have even been involved with this case in the first place. What did you mean by that? He says, listen, I had been working on a national election for years and on election infrastructure. And so leadership decided, I was told that it was worth pulling me from this project that I'd been working on for all of these years to address this threat. When I heard the briefing on Alfa Bank, I made the determination it was something that I could assist with, that it was going to divert time from what I had been working on. Had I known that this information had been provided with another potential motive, it's highly unlikely that I would have volunteered to assist with that, and I would have just stayed on my already assigned assignment, which was already stressful and important. Thank you. Okay, so very material. It was very consequential. And in fact, it caused this poor FBI agent, Ryan Gaynor, to leave his other post and go to this new fake hoax post. So he's very upset about that. And he should be, right? It is a material decision, and he had to change course. So we've got, to wrap this up, we've got the final cross-examination from Bosworth. And he gets a little bit testy here, but we see we've got about another 40 or so pages. And so we'll be able to fly through this relatively quickly. But it's time for a water break. Cheers, my friends. And I'm taking a look at the chat. And thank you to everybody who's sending in those transcript donations. Those super chats are very helpful. These are a lot of fun to go through, but they do cost a pretty penny. And so thank you for your support. We wouldn't be able to do this without you. And we'll get to those here at the end of the show today. But for now, it's cross-examination time. We've got defense attorney Mr. Bosworth, representing Michael Sussmann, coming out against FBI Special Agent Ryan Gaynor and says, good morning, Mr. Gaynor. We've never met before, have we? And you've never interviewed Sussmann, right? No. And you've never allowed other agents to interview Sussmann. And this FBI agent's going to get a little testy. He says, what do you mean by that? You never allowed other agents to interview Sussmann. Defense attorney says, well, you concealed Sussmann's identity from the Chicago, didn't you? He says, well, there was a close hold put in place by senior leadership. I mean, a decision had been made on that information. I didn't have to withhold that information from the field office. Defense says, well, did you share his identity with Chicago? Yes or no? And he says the leadership office did not allow me to share the information with the Chicago office. So you didn't share his identity with agents, correct? Correct. Now, you talked about election infrastructure project. You were working on protecting the election from the Russians, right? Yeah. And that overlapped with Crossfire Hurricane, which was another investigation into ties between Trump and Russia, right? Yeah. He says the election infrastructure program that I was looking into did not overlap with Crossfire Hurricane. No. Says there was potential for overlap, but if we found there were links, but the actual election infrastructure project did not. Says I was briefed on Crossfire Hurricane to ensure that I had awareness of what was going on, but wasn't really involved. And the defense says, all right, well, you came to learn about Alpha back in September on a Friday, you said, yeah. And on the day you attended briefing about the status about this, right? Yeah. He says, I attended a briefing with Crossfire Hurricane team to learn about what was going on. And during that meeting, I was also briefed about Alpha Bank. Defense says, after hearing about the briefing, you volunteered to work on this. Says, yeah, I did. And you were working in connection with that project, and you volunteered to help with the project that you knew, didn't you, that the FBI Cyber Division had already done a quick assessment and found there wasn't much to this allegation, right? The defense is trying to say, you knew this was a garbage assignment that had no merit to it, and you decided to jump in there anyways, didn't you? He says, no, look, I learned after the meeting where I offered help after the meeting that the European Cyber Operations Unit said that it wasn't that great. They actually reviewed the white paper and then they sent it on the Friday. Okay, but after seeing that cyber division, that they said there wasn't much to this, you still proceeded to go work on this project, didn't you? He says, yeah, I continued to talk with the field office and learn about their investigation. Defense says, okay, but everything you said you did on direct exam in connection with this investigation, you did notwithstanding the fact that the cyber division had looked at this and said nothing here, right? Yes. So what he's doing is trying to sort of take the sting out of the fact that this poor FBI agent got diverted due to this hoax, saying you kind of knew it was a hoax before you took this job, didn't you? I mean, you agreed to do it, but then you learned that there's nothing here. So like, don't make this up like you're like some big, hero. Like you left your post to go save America. And then it turned out to be nothing. That's not what happened, right? Okay, he says, and why is it that you were interested in working on this project that turned out to be nothing? Why? He says, it was clear to me that the Crossfire Hurricane brief had a lot on his plate for my boss, Joe. I had just taken the election infrastructure project and I just wanted to help out by basically volunteering to track it for him. I just wanted to help my superior. And as of the time of the investigation, you knew that the allegation investigation had already been opened, right? He said they had already conducted investigative activity and initiated it. Yeah. And they submitted this on Friday, formally opening an investigation on Friday, the 23rd. He says, I learned about that after. And you played no role in the decision to open this investigation? Right. And the investigation was consistent with Crossfire Hurricane and others. He says, well, it was tangentially related and there could have potentially been a link, but it wasn't directly linked. Defense says, okay, well, you testified that you met with your boss, Maffa, and you told him about the allegations. And did he give you more detail about this? He says, he provided information to me. I don't remember the breadth and depth of it, but I put it on my briefing sheet. Defense says, so you don't remember the breadth of your conversation then, do you? We're going to get into memory here, I'm sure. So he was off work on Friday, the 23rd. I know during that time, I must have discussed it with him. Various things were missed on the prior Friday because he was not there. So I know that he knew more than obviously I would, but I've already testified about my takeaway. Defense says, we're going to get there. Defense asks, one of the things he told you was that the allegation was provided by Sussman. And he told you that Sussman was a DNC lawyer, didn't he? He says, yeah, he was a DNC lawyer or a DNC attorney. And he told you that Sussman was he? Okay, yeah, he just answered that. All right, so this testimony is a little bit frustrating to read. Okay, now you testified a moment ago about your takeaway impression from what either Maffa had told you about Sussman's connection. I want to ask you about that. But first, because you talked about refreshing your recollection, I want to briefly set out, and I'm going to do it one by one, every meeting you had with the government leading up to your testimony today. And we're going to skip through all this. You looked at your notes from fall. He's going to take him through. So he's going to be basically attacking his memory, right? Do you remember this? You remember this? All of this is a little bit different. Does this jog your memory? It does. What happened on that date? 10/30/2020. Can you see this? Blow up the first paragraph. You prepared. You talked to the government at this meeting, correct? Yes. Your attorney advised you, refresh your recollection. I'm going to show you these exhibits. You swore under oath. You're pretty sure about the year. Did you review these documents? Everything you said here is truthful. You studied pretty hard for that testimony, right? Yes. And in the lead up to this trial, you met with the government. Yes. You didn't meet with the defense, just to be clear. I have not met with the defense. Do you see what this is? This is trying to make him look like a biased person. He met with these prosecutors, but he didn't meet with the defense team, which means that he is clearly biased. He gave the government the benefit of the doubt, but not the defense. And if I direct your attention to, he says, how many times did you meet with the government? I don't know, 4 or 5 times. Let's take a look at these other notes. What does this say? Another preparation session with the government. And let's see here. I want to ask you first about testimony you gave today. You said you told Mr. Mofa, I understood that to mean that he had been affiliated with the DNC, but he had come representing himself. Do you remember that testimony? Yes. Your impression was he had come away representing himself. My takeaway at that meeting, what I recall. Yeah, so this is all kind of the same stuff. Not even that interesting. All right, so let's see if we can get to another. He's going back through a bunch of different meetings. More documents, publishing this for the jury. Notes you took for yourself. Okay, and they're going to highlight this. The highlight here, DNC attorney. You met with many other people. You met with the government prosecutors. You said that he was an attorney working for the DNC. Same type of stuff here. Chief Maffa informed him about that. I think it's important to note that prior to that meeting, I had definitely not done a thorough review of the material in my possession. Okay, so it's not in your notes, right? So he's trying to beat him up over his memory and refreshing his recollection and saying that the story is basically changing a little bit. And he starts getting a little bit frustrated with some of this line of questioning. At this point, you said back on December 20th, you talked about this to-do sheet. And now he kind of chimes in, the judge jumps in and says, Mr. Gaynor, the Philippus is going to come back and do the recross on this. But why don't you just answer the question? You didn't say at this meeting that Michael Sussman, that your impression was that Sussman was affiliated with the DNC and was representing himself, right? You didn't tell the government that after the document, correct? I did not, right? So we're seeing sort of two of these things are just not matching. He's saying your statement here today doesn't match a prior statement from before. We've got another one, February 24th to 2021. This is just kind of standard impeachment stuff. You were asked a series of questions. You remember those questions? Yeah. And now none of this matches, right? Here, you said it's an attorney named, and now it's just basically every single one of these meetings is recorded, cataloged, emailed, and he's just going to say they don't match, right? He's being inconsistent. And this is how you attack somebody's credibility and memory. Again, you explained, I wrote in my notes that he was a DNC, I believe an attorney. And then you were asked, is that your testimony? Yes. But now it doesn't matter. And now it's all right, we're going to fast forward through this because this is all pretty boring stuff. Talking about he may be giving an additional background. Okay, but it is your testimony, though, that you didn't know that. All right. So I should have probably pre-read a lot of this and just skipped over a lot of this because it's pretty boring. Still talking about prep sessions for this trial. Okay, if that was the first prep session for this trial, it's the first time it got brought up. Does this refresh your recollection? The notes are sparse on this meeting. Let's go to another exhibit. This one's May 13th, 2022. Does this refresh your recollection about what you told the government on this date? I believe this is a reflection of the prior prep session as well. So every single one of these meetings, you're an FBI agent. You know what it's like to take notes of trial preparation. Yeah. And you know, don't you, that when you meet with the witness and the witness says something new, something that isn't reflected in their notes, you have to write it down, right? Okay. So if, for example, you said you hadn't said before, the agents taking notes would have to write down, here's what Mr. Gaynor said he hadn't said before, right? That's why prior notes are introduced so that they're consistent with prior testimony. And now, so he's just sort of beating him up with his prior notes. I've reviewed the material. Even though you reviewed the material, you didn't say anything about this impression then, did you? Let's keep going. Another meeting, October 2020. Multiple times you said this. He says, correct. That was wrong. So here's like a good question. Here's what's showing you. You told them multiple times that you believe the DNC was the source of the allegations between Alfa Bank and Russia, right? Correct. That was wrong. And so the defense attorney's just trying to get him to say, I was wrong. That was incorrect. I misspoke, whatever. You testified to the grand jury. Do you remember? You believe the DNC. You said that that's where the information came from, but now you don't believe that, right? Correct. Your answer was at the time, because information had come where it came from, it didn't appear that we'd be able to utilize that. You gave that answer, didn't you? And you were asked, is it hindering to know this, right? Yeah. And he says, I was referencing it. Okay, but your testimony is now changing. Now the court's going to cut him off. Yeah. Because this guy had a lot of prep with the government. Mr. Bosworth, how much longer do you think you have? Judge says, quite a while. All right. Court says, okay, this might be a good time to break if we're moving to a new subject. And so all of that was impeachment. Let's see how it wraps up. So it's your testimony that Mr. Sussman is the embodiment of the Democratic National Committee? He says, no, it's not. It's my testimony, however, my statement, that the DNC itself is such close proximity to the election and conducting an overt investigative act related to it would have been potential violation of policy. Defense says, okay, well, let's keep going, right? So these two are getting into it. The defense attorney and this FBI agent are not liking each other. This FBI agent's getting irritated that he's sort of not being consistent, right? A lot of his statements during the grand jury proceedings where he's saying the DNC was more responsible for this, the defense team just went out, they just got a bunch of emails and a bunch of the recordings and they got everything transcribed and they just say, you used this word today, but you used that word 2 months ago and 5 months ago and 9 months ago, and nothing matches up. And so the judge is even asking, are you done with this, or how much more of this are we going to do? Defense says, now you believe, didn't you, that the investigation into the links between Alfa Bank and Russia should be driven by data, correct? And so that's when the court intervenes. And then I think says that, so it sounds like we're going to stop beating him up over the prior meetings. We'll get into some actual testimony. Bosworth says, okay, we'll take a break. Court says, ladies and gentlemen, it's about 12:30. We've got lunch ahead. Have a great lunch. Don't talk about the case. And the jury exits the courtroom. So now then we get some closing things to wrap up here. It says, all right, step down. Don't discuss your testimony. We have a sealed motion that the government filed last night. Oh, great. We're going to have to see what this one is. Give me 1 minute. Let's see what this one is. So sounds like we've got a sealed motion the government filed late last night, which I have not seen yet. Well, let's pull this open. But it says, the judge says, I wonder if there's anything we can do about this so that we can discuss it without disclosing too much. Prosecutor says, yeah, judge, actually, I think we can. Without referring to whatever witness, we believe this is, a matter that has not been adjudicated yet, they write. It's an open investigation. There's no findings to it. It's not appropriate to cross-examine this witness. Court says, okay, do you want to address both those issues in a general way? 608 rules. All right. So again, more sort of speculation. I think really they're talking a little bit about some of Lichtblau. Court says Prosecutor Al Gore says, I think there's a clear distinction between, yeah. All right. Court says, let's come back at 1:15 until 2 o'clock. If I need to take sealed evidence, we can figure out how to do that, but I don't think I will. He's not even the next witness, so we may not get to him today, says Berkowitz. All right, so I wanted to pull open just the public access over on the federal court docket and see if I can see exactly what's going on here before we exit out of here for the day. But that was, oh, look at this. 1, 2, 3, 4 is when they take their lunch break, which is very appropriate. Let's see. Minute entry. Trial's going to resume. All right, I wanted to show you this just so you can see what the federal court docket looks like here today. We've got 5:23 a minute entry. Jury trial is going to resume tomorrow, 9 a.m. Natalie Hardway. Okay. Reply in support of Eric Lichtblau. And I actually don't see the motion that was filed that they're talking about, the sealed motion. So, all right, my friends. Well, that is day 6. So that's in the can. We had sort of, some interesting testimony there today. I think that cross-examination was very, very dry, and I'm not sure how much that will be useful. Impeachment is good, but when you just go on and on and on and on with that, I'm not sure how effective that is. But let's take a look at what you have to say about this. We've got the chat in the house. I saw some of those amazing super chats come in. Thank you, everybody. Those are all transcript donos that are going right into the transcript dono fund, and we're paying the court reporters as soon as they come in. And so we wouldn't be able to do this without you. So thank you to everybody who sent those in today. And let's get started. Earlier, we had... Where am I at here? We started the show off earlier today with James R. Crypto, who said, I always admired the FBI and I needed to pledge you this. Thank you, James R. Crypto. Tom Conwell, also with a super chat dono. Thank you, Tom Conwell. We have Anthony Henson, another dono. No question on that one. Thank you, Anthony. Here we got Dapper Dave, 2021, says, Robert, thank you for doing these federal cases. It's frustrating that these federal cases are not open to the public. You getting the transcripts and reviewing court filings in Pacer to expose the cover-ups and the fraud. That was from Dapper Dave. And Dapper Dave, wouldn't be able to do this without you, my friend. There's your comment. So thank you for supporting the show and contributing to that transcript fund. We have Kay Shaw with the super chat dono. Another one from Frank Burke. Thank you, Frank Burke. Diamond Gun is here, says invest in some additional, tools for individuals. Tammy Clayton just became a member on YouTube. Shout out to Tammy Clayton for becoming a member. Also with a dono, says thank you for being a lawyer who can be trusted. That came in from Tammy Clayton as well. Well, thank you for that, Tammy. I appreciate that. We try to do things with integrity at our firm. The R&R Law Group over at rrlawaz.com. We have an awesome team of people. We have a big quarterly training meeting tomorrow. So we're getting the whole crew together at our office in Scottsdale, and we're learning about, I think, teamwork and communication. We have a coach, Coach Troy. Many of you have met Coach Troy, and Coach Troy is coming in to educate us on very good things. Every time he leaves, it's like, that's pretty good stuff. Last time we learned about sort of our personalities, and we separated ourselves into reds and greens and yellows and I think blues, sort of how you're wired, right? The more you learn about yourself, the more you can interact with your team, I think, in a more effective and productive way. So we're doing that tomorrow, and that's going to be fun. Who else do we have here? Diamond Guns in the house says, Mook, noun, a stupid or incompetent person. That was from Diamond Gun. And so I learned that his actual name is Mook, I guess. I'm going to continue to call him Mook because it sounds a lot more condescending that way, and I prefer it. Here we have another one from Thomas Luce. Says, thanks for everything, Rob. Here's a little something for the Travis Matthews Fund. Who's Travis Matthews? Isn't that a singer? Travis Matthews? Sporting good. Oh, I think that's the shirts that I wear, right? The Travis Matthews Fund. Well, I'll use separate funds for that. This is going to, right now we're on Sussman mode. So that's going to go into the transcript dono fund. That was from Thomas Luce, but thank you for that. The Travis Matthews Fund. I think those are the shirts I wear. I forgot. We have another one from Kevin Blalock. Says, thanks for covering this in depth. Keep up the great work, with a nice, generous transcript dono as well. We had Mary Ann Beatties in the house. Says, thank you for always keeping this entertaining. There was some spiciness a little bit today. I was certainly kind of irritable with some of these FBI agents, as I'm sure you could tell. But I appreciate you being here, Marianne, and thank you for the dono. AC's in the house, and I know who that is. That is, thank you for doing what no one else will. Cheers. And right back at you, AC. You guys are doing great work over there also. Mary Briggs here with a dono, no question, but thank you, Mary Briggs. We had a couple others come in. Steve MacDaddy's in the house. Says, really appreciate the way you break things down and put them in layman's terms. Cheers, Robert. Well, I appreciate you back, Steve MacDaddy. Thanks for being here and for the dono. Elaine Smith says, much love from Texas. You are a very good reader too. Just like the FBI agent. Yeah, maybe maybe somebody could tap me on the head. Yeah, but we've been reading a lot here, 2 or 3 hours of reading. It's a lot. But it's good stuff, man. I would, I'd be lonely if I wasn't reading these with you here, and I wouldn't be able to get them if if we couldn't do this together. Me spending $4,000 to just sit here and read transcripts in a dark corner on a Sunday night. I mean, that might happen at some point, but I appreciate you allowing us to do this out openly on YouTube. It's much better this way. So, all right, that was from Elaine Smith. Our Childy is here, became a member. We got another member on YouTube. Very grateful for that. Katie Hale's in the house with no question, but a nice dono. Thank you, Katie. Robin Hoban says thank you with a super chat. Thank you, Robin. I appreciate you back. Jeb Fuller's here, says, does anything that comes out of in this trial help with future Durham targets, or do you think he has all info already? So I think he's got sort of a plan framed out. When I created the mind map, I put Durham in the center for that reason. I think that there may be more prosecutions that come out of this thing. But I think that if we had additional prosecutions coming out of this, they would be towards Peter Strzok, maybe. I think Peter Strzok and Andy McCabe, who I don't even know that I have on here. But I mean, yes, the short answer is yeah. If they get convictions on this, then they know at least, that a DC jury is willing to convict, that there's enough here to put together a case. You can actually connect the dots. And a lot of this, there are many layers here. The reason why this was so powerful is because there's multiple layers. Basically Sussman is like 4th, 5th layer down. And there's all sorts of force fields and different layers of protection that keep the actual players eliminated, right? Sussman is sort of a pawn of Mark Elias, who works at Perkins Coie, which is a law firm. So there's all sorts of privilege and work product and attorney-client protections that exist there. Fusion GPS is a consultant for a law firm. And so they inherit a lot of those same protections. And some of what they have been communicating about is also protected and privileged. And then there's many layers underneath them. You've got Newstar, Rodney Jaffe, all the Peter Fritsch founders. You've got journalistic privileges and protections. And it just, there's multiple layers deep. So my point is Durham is in the middle of this thing. So there may be some additional tentacles that pop out that are prosecutions of Peter Strzok or even Andy McCabe. Could be somebody else. His name is being floated around as somebody who might be potentially prosecuted. We have Lava Java Lava in the house. Lava Java Lava has been around for a long time. Grateful to have you still here, Lava. I remember you back in the early live chat days. You've seen this background change and all sorts of stuff. I'm glad that you're still here. Just Cause is in the house, says F Pages and Zulu's Saki after work funds. Subscribe. Just Cause is here. Thank you, Just Cause. Zulu's Saki after work funds. Well, there you go, Zulu. We should all probably have a moment of silence for Zulu because Saki's not in the White House press briefing room anymore. Moment of silence. Okay. And hopefully there is a lot of healing that happens in those parts of the world that need it. For the Saki, heartbroken. I know you're out there. We have Stephen Sales just became a member also over on YouTube, and I'm very appreciative of all your support, everybody. Thank you for that. Like I said, we would not be able to do this without your support with those transcript donos. Saw a couple questions come in over on locals. We got one from Schluthi is here, says Durham's team has access to the testimonies of these people given to the OIG back when their recollection was more recent history. It seems that Horowitz's team has these guys on record about all these meetings they can no longer remember. I came in a little late to the stream. Did the prosecution use those statements to jog their memory? Why wouldn't they? At least on redirect. And so, no, they didn't, Steve. Steve. They really didn't. I mean, they impeached them with a little bit, but they had Mark Elias on the stand, and I don't recall every other stinking sentence. I mean, I don't know if you remember that, but he almost was not impeached with most of that. The FBI agents, I mean, really were not impeached on a lot of this. Most of it was just, I don't recall. And I don't know specifically what types of meetings you're referencing, but they did bring up some prior congressional testimony and things. I mean, they brought up, for example, Jim Baker's testimony when he was talking in front of Congress. Michael Sussman talked in front of Congress, but he's very unlikely to testify. So, you know, and some of that testimony was not under oath, but it's a crime to lie to Congress. And there was all sorts of different, we'd have to take it bit by bit. And remember, even when there is other stuff that you can talk about, the judge has said some of it is precluded because of privilege reasons or because of confidentiality reasons. Stuff is being filed under seal. And it's a good question, but there's a lot there. I mean, you could really apply that, I think, to any single witness who was called in this case. We had another one from Jeremy, JC the Music Man, says, can a witness be compelled to remember something? It seems the frequent excuse to get out of difficult questions is to not recall. The Constitution only guarantees silence, not a lack of recollection, though I don't see the difference. So it's hard to, you know, make somebody remember something. In law, we call it impeachment. We say, you do remember this, or you're kind of being a jerk about this. And the prosecution did that with Mark Elias. I mean, and I think they did a pretty effective job on that. They took Mark and they just put up meeting invite after meeting invite after meeting invite, like 6 of them. It was kind of tedious and annoying, but it was also tedious and annoying the way Mark Elias, somebody presumably a very smart lawyer who's highly complicated, can remember a lot, couldn't remember anything, right? And the prosecution said, well, that's weird. You've got this date like March 7th. You had a meeting on that date and you were there. You don't remember that? Well, weird. Well, how about this one? How about May? How about June? How about July? Don't remember. That's pretty weird. You know, it sounds like you had a lot of work on this project. You had like 70 meetings about this, multiple conversations. You don't remember that? Okay. And then you just sort of say to those jurors, he's full of crap, obviously. Can't you tell? This guy knows exactly what he's talking about. And so his credibility is shot, but you can't beat somebody into coming up with a memory in trial. Southson Academy's over there, says she's joining us over on the locals chat. And I think that's what we had from our comments thread over on locals. And thank you to our supporters over there. We also have a live stream cooking away over there. And Vientikis is there chatting away with Bonnie Speck, Earth Boys in the house. JC the Music Man's over there. And there's some memes flying away in the chat. And so thank you, everybody, on our locals community as well. And I think that is it for us for the day, my friends. So we got another full day of transcripts in the can, got those completed. We're going to pick up tomorrow with Allison Sands, the technical analyst who testified in the later half of today. My understanding is tomorrow, actually, I can't remember who they said they're going to call tomorrow, but we're going to do it all again. We're going to cover this thing. The government's case should be resting this week. I don't know if the defense is going to rest this week, or if we're going to hand this thing off to the jurors, but we're going to continue to cover it regardless of what happens. And I appreciate you joining us as we do. And we're going to leave it there, my friends. So I want to invite you before you leave to subscribe if you have not already done so. I would really appreciate a like if you have not already left one on this video. Thank you to everybody who sent in those super chat. Thank you, donos. If you became a member, if you're supporting us over on locals, very much appreciated. It allows us to get these transcripts and to continue to do them. I will post this over on the mind map, the transcripts later on the evening. And that's it, my friends. If you have anybody you know that might be interested in this trial, I'd very much appreciate you sharing it with them. And don't forget, if you know anybody in the state of Arizona who's been charged with a crime, our law firm is very good at what we do and we love helping good people. And so I'd ask you to send your referrals over to us. We have a great team of people. And if we can do good at our law firm and do good here, then it's just sort of a good way to help people. We've got, sort of the things we talk about online and then boots on the ground in the courts fighting for justice every day. And so I appreciate you helping us help other good people out there in our mission, regardless of where we are, at the law firm or here on YouTube. But that, my friends, is it for us for the day. That last super chat came in from San Francisco Live, and that's a good way to end it. Thank you, San Francisco. Thank you to all of you, my friends. Have a tremendously good evening. Sleep very well, and I will see you all back here tomorrow. Bye-bye, my friends.